The story begins on a bright and cloudy morning, where the sound of a chef clanging pots and shouting can be heard, urging everyone to wake up. A heavily muscled man with brown hair lies asleep on a bed. His name is Enkrid. Nearby, a gray-haired man, adjusting his boots, remarks that something is inside his boot. Enkrid wakes up upon hearing the man screamed there was a bug from beside him, and groggily wakes up. As a muscular man, Rem's features marked by fatigue and battle scars. Meanwhile, Chris, an orange-haired man, yawns and wakes up, while the long-haired gray man contemplates the cross, as Enkrid mulling over his demotion to squad leader for these dimwits. In the tent, a blonde-haired, muscular man sleeps unaware, and a red-haired man is peeling a stick as he sits on a wooden box outside. The soldier's horns blow, signaling the start of the war. Aware that he has no special powers or extraordinary talents, Enkrid prepares for the oncoming battle. He fights, reflecting that he had reached this point only through endless training, but that this might be his end. A soldier from the opposing side attacks, but Enkrid deflects the blow with his protective iron shield and counters by kicking the soldier in the abdomen. Another enemy soldier grabs him by the waist and pinned him down as he raises a fist to strike. At that moment, a soldier from Enkrid's side intervenes, delivering a blow to the enemy soldier's neck. Enkrid attempts to reach for his sword, but doubts his abilities. He believes his dream of becoming a knight is unattainable. Before he can act, an arrow strikes his savior soldier, who falls. Enkrid looks on in disbelief, realizing that even though others mocked him and told him his dream would never come true, he still wanted to become a knight. As the enemy soldier approaches, Enkrid feels the blade strike his throat. The soldier lifts him by the throat, and blood spills from his mouth. Enkrid believes his dream has been worn out and that his death will be a pitiful one. He collapses on the ground, vomiting blood. In the next moment, as he looks up, a whisper of a blue flame floats past him. He gazes at it in confusion, seeing the blurred face of an old man. The scene shifts, and Enkrid finds himself sitting amidst a flat plain of water. A voice echoes, telling him to wake up. He snaps his eyes open, sitting up and holding his throat, unsure if what he's experiencing is a dream. As the scene repeats, the gray-haired soldier mentions a bug in his boot, dropping it on the ground. Enkrid watches in disbelief, thinking that it's a déjà vu. The battle plays out once again, just the same as before. The sword that struck him came once again, slit his throat the same way as before. As if the day repeated, the chef calls out, waking everyone up as he clatters his pots. Enkrid remains in bed, suspiciously clutching his neck, recalling the burning pain and blood he had experienced. The day repeats itself, and the enemy soldier strikes at him once more, as if following a predetermined path. Enkrid questions if he will ever escape this cycle of death. The scene of his death repeats again. The soldier's sword pierces his throat, and Enkrid reflects that this is the 17th time he has experienced this fate. Blood gushes from his neck as he lies injured, questioning if he had only worked harder or wielded his sword more effectively. As the soldier carelessly walks away, Enkrid remains on the ground, bloodied. The battle rages around him, but he asks himself if this is where he will die. He once again finds himself in the flat plain of water where a lantern appears. The figure of an old man asks him if he believes that it is truly him, the same man who had appeared before. The figure urges Enkrid to get up and continue struggling, though Enkrid feels the despair weighing on him. The man tells him that he is up against a wall he cannot cross, suggesting that he should give up. However, Enkrid feels anger rising within his mind as he sits on the waves, frustrated by the hopelessness in the air. Another day breaks, and the chef clatters his pots, waking everyone up. Enkrid lies silently on his bed, unmoving. The gray-haired soldier, now wearing his boots, calls out to Enkrid, commenting how he woke up immediately. Enkrid responds by telling Rem that there is a bug in his boots and watches as Rem looks inside, eventually squashing it under his foot. Rem asks Enkrid if he's the one who placed the bug in his boot, to which Enkrid nonchalantly replies, walking away while holding his sword. Enkrid looks at the bug's crushed body and realizes it's the 18th time he's seen it. He lifts the curtain to exit, but a thought crosses his mind. If this cycle keeps repeating, he wonders if he will ever find a way to break free from this endless loop. He steps outside, feeling the weight of the past 18 repetitions weighing heavily on him. Enkrid recalls his youth, when he first wielded a sword and learned the art of swordsmanship from a retired mercenary who had come to his village by chance. The old mercenary, sitting on the ground, praised Enkrid, saying that if he was already this impressive, he could become a knight. Enkrid looked at him in surprise, starting to dream of what it would be like to be a knight. A knight who could slay thousands and change the dynamics of a battlefield, an incredible hero who could end a war. He imagined himself as the protagonist of songs sung by a wandering minstrel, one who would leave the village and become a knight. However, there were others who mocked him. A portly man made fun of Enkrid, asking if anyone had seen the newbie fall earlier. A small bearded man questioned how someone so scared of a stray dog could ever dream of becoming a knight. Another man bluntly told Enkrid that he wasn't good enough to be a free mercenary, binding strips around his arms. Enkrid reflected on his journey. He had left his village and joined a mercenary corps, only to realize that his talent might not be extraordinary. He looked at his sword, thinking that it was too soon to give up. He had learned that hard work never betrays anyone. From a young age to adulthood, he had practiced relentlessly, believing that with time and effort, he could overcome any obstacle. Even if he wasn't talented, he was determined to push through. One day, Enkrid raised his sword with fury and killed a beast, striking it directly in the center of its head. He looked at the kill, thinking that he had gained experience, strength, and endurance. He was becoming stronger, earning the respect of those around him, and inching closer to his goal of becoming a knight. However, his hope was soon shattered when someone struck his sword into the air, stabbing him slightly in the abdomen. Enkrid stood, watching as a small boy struck. This child had requested a duel and, without hesitation, declared that Enkrid was weak. Enkrid thought about how this boy, who was only 12 and had been learning swordsmanship for just 6 months, had effortlessly bested him. With little experience, the boy was already more skilled than Enkrid, who had spent over a decade perfecting his craft. Feeling dejected and ashamed, Enkrid sat on the ground, pondering if all his hard work had been in vain. Was there really no way for him to achieve his dream? It was midnight when Enkrid continued practicing, determined to become a knight. He spent less time eating and sleeping than the others, dedicating himself entirely to his swordsmanship. He swung his sword again and again, frustrated but resolute. As the day broke, Enkrid gazed at the marks he had left on the tree, convinced that if he couldn't become a knight, he would at least become an experienced soldier. He struck the tree again and again, pushing himself harder. 3 years later, Enkrid found himself in the present day at the Cyprus Division, part of a mere second-rate team within the 4 companies for platoons. His endless training had led him to the best position he could achieve, a regular soldier in the kingdom's army. Being a soldier was better than living the uncertain life of a traveling mercenary. He glanced at the red-haired man, Jackson, who was peeling a stick, and called out to him, asking if he would take over his morning duty rotation. Looking incredulously at him, Jackson agreed, but told him to repay the favor next time. As Jackson walked away, Rem, another soldier, approached Enkrid, expressing his rudeness. Undeterred, Enkrid asked Rem to teach him the heart of the beast again. Unsure, Rem eyed him suspiciously and reminded Enkrid that he had given up on learning the technique last time. Did he really think it would work now? The day progressed, and Enkrid remembered the countless battles in which he had died repeatedly, only to start over, try to learn the heart of the beast from Remington. Each time he returned to life, he failed to watch the tip of the sword that killed him, unable to evade it. Despite the endless repetition, Enkrid continued, unwilling to give up on his dream of becoming a knight. On the battlefield, Enkrid observed the soldiers standing at attention, preparing to attack their enemies. As the battle commenced, he fought, killing one soldier after another. This was his 21st time on the same battlefield, and he knew it all too well. He had memorized every move, every attack. When an arrow flew toward him, he dodged it, just as he had countless times before. A spear came from behind, but he managed to block it, though the next attack he remembered was toward the soldier behind him. It was inevitable. He was fated to die. This time, he blocked the arrow, using his protective iron shield. He watched a soldier leap toward his teammate, But Enkrid was quick to slice the soldier's head from his body, his skill growing with each repetition. Enkrid thought it worked, though he had blocked the first arrow, then struck down another enemy, completing his first goal of the day. As his enemy lay on the ground, he looked up at the soldier who had killed him repeatedly. This soldier, with a casual air, stabbed another soldier in the abdomen before pulling his blade out. The soldier glanced at Enkrid, observing that he always seemed to end up facing him without fail. He walked toward Enkrid, and Enkrid, remembering how the soldier had stabbed his neck and killed him 20 times, believed that this time he would survive. The soldier giggled insolently and advanced to attack. Enkrid recalled the moment when Rem had threw his axe in the air and mentioned how Enkrid had always closed his eyes in dangerous situations. Rem had shown him how to catch an axe and instantly struck at his neck, teaching him that to survive on the battlefield, one needed to be brave and not easily agitated. He needed to become a person who didn't fear death, like a beast, cold and unfeeling. That was the heart of the beast. As the soldier charged, thrusting his sword toward Enkrid's neck, Enkrid asked himself if he feared death. He decided that death only made him stronger. Enkrid stepped aside, just as the soldier's sword struck, narrowly dodging the blow. He observed the sharp edge of the blade coming dangerously close and felt his heart stop for a brief moment. For the first time on his 21st try, he successfully dodged the stab. Both Enkrid and the soldier looked at each other in surprise, each raising their swords at different angles, preparing for another strike. The soldier pointed his sword toward Enkrid's neck again, and Enkrid's eyes distorted as he made his move, stabbing toward the soldier's throat. Yet, Enkrid fell once again, blood spilling from his mouth and neck. At that moment, a boat appeared, and an old man stood up on the ship, calling out to Enkrid. He spoke of the endless day Enkrid had been trapped in, feeling pain and despair. The old man urged Enkrid to give up, to board the boat, acknowledge his weakness, and find peace. Sitting on the plain of water's waves, Enkrid refused, laughing insolently. He declared that day would never come, before he cursed the old man with some colorful words. The day began again, and the chef clanged his pots, waking everyone up. Still determined, Enkrid thought to himself that he was moving one step at a time. He decided to re-challenge himself on the 22nd day. Yet, the battle kept repeating, and Enkrid found himself in the fight, thinking that this was the 33rd time he had seen the tip of the sword aimed at him. He could clearly see the attack coming and dodged it, ready to avoid it before the sword reached him. But suddenly, the soldier attacked from a different angle, striking his shoulder. Too slow to react, Enkrid fell to his knees. His necklace snapped, and he collapsed to the ground. He remembered his days as a mercenary, resting under a tree after killing wolves. He recalled accepting a few requests to subjugate monsters, though he didn't consider himself fully qualified. One day, he stumbled upon a random village, where the villagers asked for his help. Eager to become a knight and protect the weak, Enkrid decided to assist them. A man in the village held Enkrid's hands and handed him a peculiar item. The man explained that this was all they could offer, as their village was poor. Enkrid looked at the pendant, considering it a laughable reward for risking his life. However, the old man assured him that it would grant Enkrid's desperate wish. Lying on the ground, Enkrid gazed at the pendant, wondering if it had somehow caused this endless cycle, this repeating day, in order to help him become a knight. Observing Enkrid, the nameless soldier raised his sword again, preparing to kill him. He taunted Enkrid, saying there would be mercy in this blow. Silently glaring at him, Enkrid saw the soldier's arrogant smile and realized that the soldier found pleasure in stabbing people. Once again, Enkrid was killed. The day began anew with the usual announcement to wake everyone up. Binding his hands, Enkrid told Rem that he had placed a bug in his boots. Furious, Rem threw the bug away and scolded him for playing tricks. As the day began, Enkrid glanced at the bug walking beside him and crushed it. He told Rem to stop talking and come out. Enkrid then asked Rem to teach him the heart of the beast. Curious and suspicious, Rem looked at Enkrid before lifting his weapon. Thus, they have their usual sparring that morning. Enkrid carefully observed Rem's attack, stepping back and dodging it. Now silent and still, Rem asked Enkrid how the skin of his heart had suddenly thickened. With nonchalant, Enkrid replied that he had trained. Rim questioned how that could happen so quickly, especially considering Enkrid had already attempted this more than 10 times before. Thinking to himself, Enkrid had learned it from death itself. He asked Rim if there was anything essential about that, and suggested, by chance, Enkrid had discovered it. Rim looked at him in disbelief, but Enkrid took out a sword placed with the other weapons. He suggested that they have one more sparring match. Uncertain, Rim smiled smugly and accepted, saying that it sounded like a great idea. Observing his quick attack, Enkrid thought that if he truly possessed the heart of the beast, he would simply kill his enemies when he couldn't land a strike, dodging their attacks. As he rushed forward, Rim called out, questioning how long Enkrid would continue dodging, addressing him as squad commander. With a swift strike aimed at Enkrid's neck, Ram's attack barely missed after Enkrid pulled his head. Enkrid thought about the only sword technique he possessed at that moment, the anomalous mercenary sword technique, an unorthodox style developed by a mercenary named Valen. Stepping back, Enkrid remembered that the technique was often criticized by others, seen as nothing more than a trick. Being on mid-leap, Rim commented on Enkrid's weak lower body strength. Hearing this, Enkrid thought that despite everything, his technique was the most solid he had. He held a position, silently awaiting Ram's next move. Enkrid then copied the stance of a nameless soldier who had killed him many times before, attacking in the same way. But suddenly, Rim struck his sword into the air, the blade spinning as Enkrid looked on, surprised by its movement. He remembered the arrogant smile of the nameless soldier who had killed him, and for a moment, Enkrid realized that this was the same attack that had killed him countless times. His body, from all the deaths, had learned the movements. Enkrid clenched his fist, thinking that this was the stab that had brought his demise. He watched Ram, who remarked that Enkrid should have had some blood on his hands by now. Among all the things he had shown him, Rim noted that this stab was the most decent one. Enkrid thought about his own hands. If he had followed the technique correctly, his hands should be bleeding by now. Rim hesitated, suggesting that if Enkrid's attack failed, he should be ready for what came next. He told him that dodging wouldn't be enough, and that Enkrid was just someone who couldn't hold onto his sword. Silently, Enkrid thought about Ram's words, realizing that he had misunderstood earlier. He recalled the time he had tried to block an attack, thinking about the difference between his own stab and the soldier's, one where he had been stabbed in the neck. He coughed up blood as he sat on the ground, reflecting on how he lacked confidence in his sword. Pointing his sword at Enkrid, the nameless soldier mockingly said there would be mercy before stabbing him in the back. Enkrid thought back to the time when he had been about to attack again, but Ram's powerful strike knocked the sword from his hand. Enkrid remembered the arrogant laughter of the soldier as he had been stabbed. He thought that even if it was just one step forward at a time, he would keep going. The same day repeated, and Enkrid, now resigned, was stabbed again in the neck. He reflected that he would advance, even if it was only a quarter of a step. Over the 101st, 123rd, and then 124th day, the same cycle of death continued, with a nameless soldier delivering the same blow. Each time, Enkrid was skewered at his neck, hearing the familiar phrase of mercy as he died. On the 124th day, Enkrid practiced with Ram, who was attacking him with full strength. To Ram's shock, Enkrid's fighting stance had changed. Staring at him, Rim asked if he had gone mad, noticing the blood quickly oozing from Enkrid's hand. Grinning insolently, Enkrid realized that he had mastered his stab. He felt a surge of speed and murderous intent. Bringing his hand forward with the aim to kill the nameless soldier. But the sword dragged against his helmet, and in return, the soldier killed Enkrid once again, with the same way, a sword through Enkrid's neck. Enkrid thought that his first stab attempt had failed, but he refused to let go of his sword. He stared at the soldier, his mind replaying every clash of their swords and the strike just moments before. As the soldier stepped on his chest, mocking his suffering, he raised his sword once more, saying this would be mercy. Before the nameless soldier delivered his execution, Enkrid spoke, saying he would die tomorrow. Though, Enkrid thought that perhaps it was all just in his head. Arrogantly smiling, the nameless soldier exclaimed that the dead had no tomorrow. As if the necklace pendant hold a power out of this world, Enkrid repeated the day again. Enkrid crushed on the bug, as always as he claimed to have seen it headed in a shoe a while ago. Cracking a smile, Rim thanked Enkrid. With that, Enkrid requested that he take on guard duty. Startled by Enkrid's casual tone, Rim looked at him in disbelief. Unfazed, Enkrid walked out to start on the 125th day. He then called for Cries, asking him to get him some greaves, a shield, and a dagger, promising to pay him back later. Though irritated, Cries agreed, saying he would trust Enkrid since he was the boss, but wouldn't do anyone favors. Meanwhile, Rim approached Cries and asked if the squad commander had ever been this pushy with his requests. Overhearing, Jackson grumbled about the constant tasks Rim dumped on the leader. Furious, Rim threatened Jackson with his axe, while a long-haired, white-bearded man holding a cross sent his wishes to his squad members. Rim watched Enkrid, noting that he was acting strangely today, unusually intense. Enkrid thrust his sword into the center of a tree and raised his sword once more, as if the pain he had endured had made him feel something incredible. Every time Enkrid dies, he remembers the deathly glares and wonders whether he will ever win after thousands, maybe tens of thousands of attempts. He questions if there is any way to escape this endless cycle, to survive, or if he would simply wake up tomorrow and face the same day again. He wonders if he will ever break free from this loop. Enkrid tells himself that he has grown stronger, asking if it isn't enough to be content with that. But he knows that is not an option for him. He has to surpass the wall in front of him. Standing in a plain of water, Enkrid saw the nameless soldier as the wall, thinking about the stabbing technique he wants to master. He pierces his sword forward, determined not to abandon this blessing, and with all his strength, he shatters a tree in half. Before the battle begins, Enkrid tightens his boots, dons his iron armor, and steeled his determination. He knows that he must keep moving forward. As the soldiers blow their horns and prepare for battle, Enkrid's team warms up, adjusting their muscles and preparing for the fight. The clash begins, and both sides rush toward each other. Enkrid fights fiercely, thinking that he lacks extraordinary skill, but he survives because of three things: preparation, luck, and a cool head. On the 46th day, a spiked mace shatters his left shoulder. On the 66th day, he rolls to dodge the mace, but is crushed by another soldier's blow to his head. On the 71st day, a soldier severs his foot, preventing him from making a counterattack against the nameless soldier. Thus, he countered by wearing reinforcement shoe and finished the soldier with his iron shield. On the 89th day, his head is split open when an axe is thrown at him. This particular soldier will interrupt his fight with the nameless soldier, so Enkrid did not let him live. Enkrid steps aside, dodging an incoming weapon, and throws the axe back, remembering how he had been trained in throwing weapons. Today, it's almost second nature to him. He sees a boy named Vel, who is right behind him, and quickly blocked an arrow aimed at him. The one who shot that arrow was the Claw of the Hawk, but Enkrid did not have time to deal with him. Enkrid had replayed this day so many times, and as another night came, he swiftly cut his head off. Right after, it is the time to face the soldier who has killed him countless times. The nameless soldier, the stabbing pervert. The nameless soldier approaches, and they stand face to face. The stabbing soldier rushes at Enkrid to kill him, but Enkrid blocks his attack with his iron shield, which crushed to pieces under the force. He steps forward, realizing that simply dodging and stabbing won't win this battle. He needs to be striking as well. As the soldier attacks again, Enkrid blocks with his sword, reflecting that the soldier is strong, nearly at the level of a prodigy. But despite his strength, the soldier lacks real combat experience, and Enkrid quickly gains the upper hand, landing a hit on the soldier's chest. Using the Valen Mercenary sword technique, Enkrid lands a sneak attack, kicking dirt to the nameless soldier's face. Right after, Enkrid leaps up and swings his sword wide, attempting to attack his opponent. In return, the nameless soldier attempts to thrust right away. Enkrid simply lifts his neck, dodging the blow, and stops ahead of him. The soldier looks insolently at Enkrid, but Enkrid knows that he now understands everything about that stab. Enkrid raises his sword and brings it down on the soldiers, causing the soldier's weapon to shatter. At that moment, an enemy soldier shots an arrow at Enkrid. The nameless soldier's sword drops from his hand, and Enkrid silently looks at him, thinking he has finally won. But just as the arrow heads toward him, someone throws an axe and shatters the arrow mid-flight. Enkrid pierces his sword into the stabbing soldier's neck. Shouting, Rem runs toward him, declaring that he will destroy the claw of the hawk. However, Jackson tells him not to waste his energy because it's already too late. As Enkrid lifts the stabbing soldier's body onto his sword, the soldier glances at his own defeat. The battle rages around them, but Enkrid continues, lowering the soldier's body to the ground. He takes a deep breath, glancing at the soldiers still fighting. Raising his sword, he declares that this is mercy. With one swift motion, he severs the nameless soldier's head from his body. Enkrid watches the soldier's body fall, thinking that he has finally broken through the wall. But suddenly, a blow to his back sends him crashing to the ground. Enkrid screams in pain as Jackson looks on in surprise, while Rem running to Enkrid's side. He sees a frog, an enemy soldier, standing over Enkrid, mocking him. Grinning, the frog tells Enkrid that he had invested so much in raising the nameless soldier, and now Enkrid has defeated him. Blood flows from the nameless soldier's body as Enkrid struggles to endure the pain. The frog raises his weapon, about to strike Enkrid down, but suddenly, an axe comes flying in, blocking the attack and saving Enkrid. As Rem attacks, the frog blocks his strike. Using his strength, Rem continues to pressure the frog. The creature watches, seemingly unfazed by their bouts, as the two battle. Rem and the frog engage, attacking from different angles and dodging each other's blows. Suddenly, a soldier from the frog's side attempts to stab Enkrid with a spear, but Jackson appears just in time, cutting the soldier's neck clean off. Rem and the frog break off, waiting for another attack. Looking at the frog, Rem tells him that if he wants to kill his squad commander, he'll need permission first. The frog, sneering at Rem, questions whether the weak person he kicked earlier is truly the commander and not Remington thinking of the warrior race to which the frog belongs. Rem considers that to defeat him, he will either have to burn him with magic or pierce his heart in a single strike. Hesitant, the frog wonders why he, a warrior of his caliber, is involved in a trivial battle like this. However, Rem looks at him with unwavering focus and thinks that he will have to put his life on the line for this fight. The frog steps back, deciding that this battle is not worth it, and turns to walk away. Rem calls him a loser as he retreats. Meanwhile, Jackson runs to retreat into another soldier who attempts to strike him as he brings Enkrid with him. In turn, Rem takes care of the soldier who's attacking Enkrid. Right after, Jackson notices a soldier approaching from his right, but Auden, another squad member, kills him from behind. Every member of Enkrid's squad saves one another, and the other soldiers continue to engage the opposing warriors. As the chaos of battle rages on, the four squad members regroup, taking defensive positions while Enkrid begins to lose consciousness. A soldier from Enkrid's side shouts for the retreat, but Enkrid is completely dazed. The soldiers pull back, and Enkrid's mid collapses as he enters the flat plain again, lying motionless. As he floats, the old man appears, telling him that although he survived for the day, it's all for nothing. He won't be able to overcome the walls that will keep appearing before him. The old man gazes down at Enkrid, telling him that his fate is to live in despair and ultimately give up. Struggling to rise, Enkrid looks back at the nameless soldier sitting on the other side of the wall. With defiance in his eyes, he stands, responding to the old man that for him, the walls exist to be overcome. Knowing Enkrid's resolve, the old man replies that he will wait for the day when Enkrid's eyes, full of ambition and greed, lose their light entirely. Enkrid opens his eyes and looks upward, noticing Rem, who is casually cleaning his ear. Rem tells him that he's in the infirmary tent and that Enkrid had been unconscious for 2 days. Blowing his finger, Rem mentions that he saved Enkrid from the frog and asks if he remembers it. Groaning in pain, Enkrid asks himself if that was truly the frog. It seems incredible that he survived. Rem tells him that his bones are not broken, though his head was severely shaken. He jokingly asks if Enkrid remembers him as his best friend forever, to which Enkrid carelessly replies that he never called Rem his friend, instead referring to him as a noble hunter. A bit irritated, Rem covers Enkrid's mouth and tells him to be silent. He looks around the infirmary tent, noting that 2 other soldiers are asleep. Rem then says that it's a secret and nothing to do with Enkrid. Still groggy, Enkrid asks Rem if he is just someone Rem has nothing to do with, or if he is his best friend. asking him to make up his mind. A new day arrives, and Enkrid made it out alive, though still in pain. A fourth squad member named Cries enters the tent and calls Enkrid as a commander. He asks for payment 3 times, questioning if Enkrid knows how much Cries spent to get him into the infirmary. Wondering why a regular soldier like him was even get his treatment in the infirmary. Enkrid then asks why he wasn't seen during the battle. Smiling slyly, Cries replies that he'll give Enkrid a special discount, but only if Enkrid agrees to pay back double. That evening, another fourth squad member named Jackson arrives at the infirmary tent. Enkrid looks at him, and, sensing that Jackson has business with him, asks. Jackson throws a small box toward Enkrid and tells him, before leaving, that the ointment should be applied twice a day, morning and evening, but instruct him not to ask where he got it from. Enkrid opens the box and realizes that it contains the same ointment Jackson used to use. He wonders if Jackson really doesn't mind sharing his personal items. A fourth squad member named Auden, holding a cross, is sitting beside Enkrid, quietly crying. Enkrid glances at him and tells him to go, as he is not dead. As night falls, Enkrid lies on the bed, reflecting on the shifts that his comrades had taken to care for him, wondering why they were all so worried about him when they were busy fighting their own battles. As Enkrid closes his eyes, he notices his blonde-haired comrade, Ragna, entering the infirmary. Ragna notices Enkrid waking up and asks why he is here. Enkrid, closing his eyes, thinks that there's no way Ragna cares about him. He believes that Ragna is only concerned because he doesn't want Enkrid to be a liability. The next morning, Enkrid notices 2 soldiers in the infirmary. One is a brown-haired man who Enkrid recognizes as the commander of another company, someone who used to pick fights with him. The other is a blonde-haired man, whose name Enkrid doesn't know, who spends most of his time staring off into space. Puzzled, Enkrid wonders how such low-ranking soldiers ended up in the infirmary, and wonders why they were there when they should have been in the field. He looks at them with suspicion, feeling a strange unease. Just then, someone else enters the infirmary. Enkrid looked at her, who appeared to have ears different from humans, with a sword at her waist. Standing there with confidence, the woman asked who the 444th squad commander was. Astonished, Enkrid stared at her with surprise. On the other hand, the second platoon leader on the far side of the tent responded in surprise, calling her a fairy. She turned to the platoon leader and asked which group he was with. He replied that he was Vengeance, the commander of the 3rd platoon in the 2nd company. The fairy suspiciously asked if his company trained him to state his race when meeting a superior. Embarrassed, Vengeance looked down and apologized, while Enkrid silently observed her, thinking she must be the new commander of the 4th company. Enkrid introduced himself as the commander of the 4th squad, 4th company, and 4th platoon. The fairy acknowledged that she had heard of his work with his difficult squad members and said she was looking forward to his contributions. She turned to leave, but before going, she stopped and asked the blonde-haired man beside her for his name. He replied, Krang. Enkrid thought to himself, wondering if Krang had just made that up, and if his attitude toward the company commander was disrespectful, or if Krang was a noble. The fairy stared at him for a moment before walking away. Enkrid continued to watch her as she left. The sun rose the next day, and Enkrid clenched his fist, then opened it, looking at his hand. He thought that most of the pain had subsided, and he was now able to put strength back into his body. It was time to start training. Vengeance asked Enkrid where he was going, and Enkrid replied that he was heading to the training area. Vengeance called him a fool, saying that he was acting tough despite being the lowest-ranking soldier. Krang silently observed the departing platoon captain departing for his training. As Enkrid raised his sword, he recalled the last battle. He thought about the precious technique he had learned, one that had cost him a great deal of money when he was young. Enkrid remembered the moment he had pierced a soldier with his sword during the final attack. He wondered what would happen if that desperate strike had failed, questioning whether it was wise to put all his hopes in one move. He also thought about Rem's axe attacks, which were all lethal, and about how, if he failed, he would die. Enkrid knew that after putting all his might into the attack, his next move was crucial. Suddenly, someone spoke, telling him he was working hard. Looking at him curiously, Krang remarked that he didn't understand what Enkrid was doing. Enkrid's hands had been twitching in the barracks, and now he was spacing out in the training area. Enkrid replied that he was training his grip strength and replicating the battle moves. Krang asked why he was doing this, and Enkrid replied that he wanted to avoid losing in a battle. A bit puzzled, Krang asked if Enkrid didn't want to get lost or if he had a bigger goal of preserving his life. Enkrid looked at him and thought about his dream. He wanted to become a knight, though he knew people would laugh at him for such a goal. Despite his lack of talent, he never stopped desiring to achieve it. In the end, Enkrid raised his sword and revealed that he wants to be a knight. Shocked, Krang looked at him. Enkrid glanced at Krang and said that it was the first time he had heard someone not laugh at him. Krang stood up, saying he remembered something, and walked away. He seemed to understand something after watching Enkrid. Enkrid stood there, silently observing him. Krang called out, saying that if Enkrid became a knight, he should remember his name. For the first time, Enkrid felt supported. It was a rare feeling of being acknowledged. Later at the tents, the red-haired man, who appeared to be the singer of the military, was playing a musical instrument and singing. Some soldiers around him shouted in praise. Sitting on a bed, Vengeance asked why the morning rations hadn't arrived yet, wondering if the soldiers planned to eat them all and serve him the crap. Holding his head, Enkrid thought about how he had woken up to the wandering minstrel's song and waited for the delayed breakfast. Instead of heading to the training area, he took a short, leisurely walk. Sitting along the way, Jackson asked how Enkrid's injuries were. Enkrid thanked him and said the medicine had worked well. Jackson told him that if he was truly thankful, he should hurry back to the squad. By nightfall, as the candles flickered, Krang wished Enkrid a good night. Enkrid replied with a simple good night as Krang laid on his bed. Enkrid thought that sleeping early was the only thing he could do for now. However, Vengeance muttered that they were talking uselessly. Enkrid closed his eyes, thinking that it had been another day of doing nothing. The morning started with a singing of the same song, and Enkrid woke up hearing them again. He wondered if the wandering minstrel had returned and why he came back. He heard Vengeance screamed again, complaining about the morning rations, saying it was loud and repetitive. Suddenly, Enkrid was shocked. He got up from the bed and passed by Jackson, who asked him about his injuries again. Enkrid thanked him and said that the medicine had worked well, but Jackson repeated the exact words from yesterday, saying if Enkrid was thankful, he should hurry and return. Enkrid was surprised to hear the same words from the day before. Enkrid convinced now that the day had repeated. The old man's voice echoed in his mind, telling him that another wall would appear to stop him, and he would have to try to survive it. As the realization dawned on him, he wondered if he had already died without realizing it. Standing before a heightened wall, he thought that his death had been more hopeless this time compared to when he had been stabbed, but it only made him more determined. It was another challenge, and he had to face it. The night arrived, and the candle flickered on the table as Enkrid lay there, thinking about who and how they had killed him. The enemy must have breached all the camp's defenses to reach him, something only possible for knights. Enkrid opened his eyes, suspecting a hidden assassin, someone who knew the location of the medical barracks and could conceal their presence. He recalled the fairy's face and her quiet, nimble demeanor, thinking she would be perfect as an assassin. She had come that day to scout the location in advance, and Enkrid felt he needed to confirm his suspicions. The swinging curtains of the tent entrance caught his attention. There was only one entrance to the medical barracks, and he knew that if he screamed, he could wake the other soldiers. He waited for the assassin to reveal themselves, but suddenly a needle stabbed into his neck. Enkrid wondered if it was poisoned, feeling a sharp pain as his body became numb. He realized that he couldn't move or speak, and his thoughts raced. This was how he had died without knowing it. As Enkrid lay paralyzed, he saw Vengeance's body, foam flowing from his mouth. The assassin was standing next to Krang's bed, and blood began to pour from Enkrid's mouth. As the assassin raised his sword, piercing Krang's chest with his sword, Enkrid's body trembled with rage, recognizing the assassin and feeling the weight of his failure. But then, a new figure appeared, tearing through the fabric of a camp with a sword. Enkrid saw another assassin, and upon noticing the ears and weapon, he realized it was her, the company leader. The sun began to rise as a familiar voice echoed in the distance, singing and playing an instrument for Cyprus. The soldiers, still engaged in their morning rituals, shouted in response. Enkrid had heard the same song 3 times in a row, his senses on high alert, but he hadn't detected the assassin's presence at all. It wasn't easy, and he realized that even if he managed to stop the assassins, he would have to face the company commander immediately afterward. Looking down at the ground, Enkrid felt helpless, just as he had a few days ago. He remembered the face of the stabbing man, the one he had decapitated, and thought that despite his victory, he was still stuck in this cycle. But Enkrid wasn't about to give up. He was determined to find a way forward, even if it meant failing again and again. He couldn't give up. The next day, Enkrid abruptly stood up. He snatched the blanket from Vengeance before he started his day. Furious, Vengeance called after him, mocking him for his behavior. He asked if today's training would involve catching cockroaches with a sword. Looking away, Enkrid casually replied that he didn't know Vengeance cared so much about him. Vengeance sarcastically said he was being kind, and Enkrid thought the sarcasm was mutual. Vengeance told him to go away, not wanting to see his face. Overhearing, Krang asked if they were arguing again, and, after a moment, he asked if he should come back later. Enkrid silently gestured for Krang to come in. As they spoke, Enkrid thought that considering how the assassins were so observant of him, he was clearly their target. He knew he was under suspicion, but he didn't want to dig deeper into something the enemy wasn't willing to reveal. Thanks to Krang, he had been involved in the assassination attempt, but he still felt uncertain. He decided to ask Krang what he really was. Krang stood silent, glanced at Enkrid, clearly not understand the question. Enkrid realized he had phrased the question poorly. His conversational skills were as bad as Rem's. Krang finally responded that it wasn't something he could tell him. Sensing Krang's reluctance, Enkrid nodded silently, understanding that Krang wasn't going to open up. Cutting into the conversation, Vengeance told Enkrid that if he was going to get such a vague answer, he shouldn't have asked in the first place. He then pointed at Krang, accusing him of not being from this country, based on his manners. Vengeance demanded to know which country Krang was spying for. Krang shot Vengeance a glare, and Vengeance seemed taken aback, momentarily intimidated. Krang walked toward his bed and firmly replied that he had not and would never betray the kingdom. Observing the exchange, Enkrid could see it in Krang's eyes and movements, an aura like that of a knight. Vengeance, now visibly frightened, asked if that was how Krang spoke to higher-ups. Krang laughed, but his tone was cold, addressing Vengeance with a respectful sir. Thinking about Krang's words and actions, Enkrid reflected that despite his knightly presence, Krang was still powerless in the face of the assassins. Enkrid lay on the bed, his mind swirling with thoughts, as Krang calmly wished him good night. He thought about how Krang seemed to be hiding something, and how Vengeance had been uncharacteristically quiet. His suspicions lingered, and he smiled, noting how Vengeance had seemed oddly calm despite the tension earlier. As he glanced at the entrance of the tent, Enkrid couldn't help but think that if assassins were to burst in now, they would all be doomed. Getting up, Enkrid grabbed his sword. Vengeance watched him with surprise, asking what he was doing instead of sleeping. Enkrid replied, his voice cold and resolute, that assassins would soon invade the tent and that Vengeance should cooperate if he wanted to survive. Vengeance turned onto his side and muttered that Enkrid had lost his mind. Krang slept peacefully, unaware of the growing tension. However, Enkrid stared at him, expecting just this reaction. But then a whisper drifted in unexpectedly, followed by sharp, needle-like objects piercing Enkrid's neck and tearing through the tent's fabric. Enkrid turned toward the others, reaching for his sword. But the assassin struck fast, killing Vengeance and impaling Krang with a swift blade to the chest. The blade cut deep, killing Krang without giving him a chance to fight. Enkrid awoke with a jolt to the sound of the same chorus, thoughts racing. There is no physical evidence of the coming assassins, which meant neither Vengeance nor Krang could be warned. The higher-ups would need to be informed to send reinforcements. But the memory of his senior's scathing remark resurfaced, asking whether he had lost his mind, threatening him into silence. Maybe, he thought, he could predict the moment of the assassin's arrival and alert everyone in time. He glanced toward the entrance, but before he could prepare a shout, a rush of blood poured from his neck. The assassins were faster than he'd anticipated. As he collapsed, his thoughts raced. He had no way to alert anyone, no way to survive the poison needles. The next night, Enkrid stood still behind the camp, his mind struggling to devise a plan. He couldn't trust anyone for help now. He needed to ambush the assassins before they made their move. Suddenly, a projectile pierced his neck once more. How was he supposed to fight an enemy he couldn't see? The night repeated. As he stood inside the tent, his thoughts became clearer. The assassins seemed to know everything, yet he could not even detect their presence. Then, in the blink of an eye, one appeared behind him and struck again. He realized that as long as he couldn't avoid their poison needles, he wouldn't survive. The repeating morning arrived. With sword in hand, Encrid counted 20 mornings and 20 deaths. Sitting on a wooden stool, the shock struck him anew. He had perished 20 times in succession. He sat in silence, then unexpectedly smiled. A shout tore from him as he opened his eyes. He told himself he had only died 20 times and began to walk. A solution had to exist. Avoiding the poison needles was the first priority. Everything else would follow. His gaze drifted to Jackson, who was cleaning a knife. Curiosity led him to ask Rem why Jackson was called a wildcat. Rem looked up, surprised, before explaining that he was simply considered a crazy person, one who avoided direct confrontations and preferred ambushing enemies, much like a cunning cat. Enkrid absorbed the information, thinking he could learn from the strategy. Jackson turned to Enkrid, inquiring about his injuries like every repeated morning. Enkrid considered how he had assumed Jackson's victory over the assassins would be simple, but he couldn't simply bring Jackson along without authorization. A memory returned, the wall that must be climbed alone. With that, he called to Jackson, deciding to emulate him instead. Enkrid posed a question. If someone like Jackson were to stab him in the back, how could it be prevented? Jackson paused, uncertain, admitting that none had ever survived one of his ambushes. Enkrid's expression shifted with surprise. A silence followed as they exchanged glances. Jackson stood and pointed to his head, explaining that to counter someone like him, one would need eyes on the back of their head. Listening intently, Enkrid questioned the meaning of such a phrase. Jackson directed his attention to a wagon behind the tents. Enkrid peered at the distant object, astonished that Jackson had noticed something so far away. Perhaps he truly had eyes in the back of his head. The wagon then collapsed with a creaking crack. Enkrid stared, stunned, asking whether Jackson was some kind of prophet. Jackson dismissed the notion, suggesting that time spent with Rem had influenced him. He explained calmly that he had heard the creaking of the wagon's axle. Hearing the world clearly, Jackson insisted, made it possible to anticipate what was coming next. Enkrid marveled at how such a faint sound had been caught. He hadn't even noticed the wagon approaching. Jackson advised that the goal wasn't to sense everything, but to focus on listening. With enough practice, the ability to isolate specific sounds could be developed. Rising to his feet, he instructed Enkrid to hone his senses and begin that very training. Enkrid acknowledged the explanation as a good one, though even that barely stirred him enough to respond. Before leaving, Jackson commented on his laziness, but remarked that it was better than having someone breathing down his neck. Lately, it seemed, Enkrid simply would not relent. As night fell, Enkrid lay silently on his bed, eyes closed. A new realization formed. He had encountered his second wall, now personified as faceless death. The assassin emerged in the shadows, using a poison-tipped needle just as Enkrid clung to the hope that survival depended on sensing the approach. He could hear only the routine march of the patrol and the crackle of torchlight. Somewhere nearby the tent, the assassin descended silently, while Enkrid strained to locate him through sound alone. The attacker landed as Enkrid desperately tried to catch even the faintest hint of his footfalls. But the moment escaped him. The needle struck his neck. As Enkrid stared at the embedded weapon, the reality of failure settled in once more. The morning repeated. Enkrid awoke to the familiar voices echoing from prior awakenings. Emerging from his tent, he reflected that he had made no progress, not a single step forward. Yet his body carried the memory of every attempt, the sensation of being stabbed, the elusive rhythm of the beast's heart, and Jackson's lessons. Jackson explained that sound alone could offer countless insights. With enough sensitivity, the location of any object could be determined by the intensity and direction of the sound. Once faint, far away, noises became perceptible. The ears would begin to serve as a second pair of eyes. Enkrid had turned toward him in surprise as Jackson snapped his fingers, continuing the lesson. Sound, Jackson said, traveled in waves, radiating in all directions regardless of how quiet it seemed. Amid the chaos of countless overlapping waves, the goal was to isolate a single one. As Jackson demonstrated, curling his hand into a fist, he instructed Enkrid to focus. Nearby, other soldiers chattered, voices blending in idle gossip. One spoke of someone removing their scarf, while another asked about a certain town and mentioned the beauty found there. Seated in meditation, Enkrid pondered the nature of these layered sound waves. His task was to identify, classify, and isolate them. The flag still sounded to him like one massive banner, though he knew there were perhaps 7 or 10. The marching soldiers passed from left to right, 3 nearby, 2 distant. Familiar vibrations mingled with unfamiliar ones. Krang called to him. Enkrid turned as Krang asked what kind of training this was. In return, Enkrid asked why he called him Ensi. Krang laughed and said the answer was obvious. It was Enkrid's own name. Closing his eyes again, Enkrid remarked nonchalantly that he was sitting like an idiot and asked if this could truly be called training. Krang replied easily that at least he wasn't the fool wasting time. Enkrid shot him a curious look. The knight fell, and the same needle struck, once again piercing the exact same spot on his throat. He turned toward the attacker in shock as the assassin drove a blade into Krang's abdomen, withdrawing it in one swift motion. Krang screamed in agony. Another failure, Enkrid thought, marking the 33rd attempt. The 34th brought little difference. The assassin landed again amidst the tents. Enkrid hadn't heard a thing. Seeing Krang slain once more, the sting of defeat weighed heavy. The word failure echoed relentlessly in his mind with each repeated night. Meditating on the ground, Enkrid recognized that no further experience, no sudden insight, no miracle would overcome this wall. It was sheer failure, during night and day alike, that he must endure and learn from. Each effort was met with resolve. The assassin moved just like how a bird landed on top of the flagpole. Yet, Enkrid did not falter. He reminded himself of the single truth. The only path forward was repetition. Midnight brought the assassin again, but Enkrid's attempt was thwarted. The morning found Enkrid in his routine once more. Krang came just like he always did, but Enkrid opened his eyes before Krang could make a sound. Krang approached with a mix of nerves and curiosity, admitting that Enkrid had somehow startled him. Krang asked if he had his eyes closed for long, or if this was some sort of sensory training. After all, no fool wasted time this way. Enkrid responded only with a silent, icy glare. That night, the assassin returned and loosed another poison needle. But Enkrid shifted, causing it to strike the pillow instead. He reached beneath it and drew his hidden sword, striking the stunned assassin and knocking him to the ground. Staring at the writhing figure, Enkrid realized with grim satisfaction that the faceless death now were no longer the faceless death. The assassin, groaning, called to him with venom and launched a retaliatory strike. Enkrid dodged. Assessing the threat, he concluded that this foe lacked the brute strength of the stabbing monster. He could be beaten. His gaze darted to Vengeance, now unconscious and pierced by a needle. Then to Krang, who was stirring and reaching for his blade. The assassin raised a dagger, poised to attack. Enkrid kept his focus. Any lapse would be fatal. He evaded the next lunge, but acknowledged this opponent's skill. An experienced assassin still stood before him. The dagger flew through the air, slashing Enkrid's chest and tearing his shirt. Just as the situation worsened, someone else appeared, landing a blow that sent the assassin flying. Enkrid turned toward the unexpected savior, a figure bathed in light. The one he thought of as the fairy, the company commander, now stood before him. Raising his sword, Enkrid knew the rule had not changed. Stab first, or die. The assassin, throwing his needles, muttered bitterly about the presence of a guard. Looking on in shock, Krang stared at Enkrid with disbelief. The needles hurtled toward them, prompting Enkrid to glance at them before shifting his attention to the fairy. With startling agility, she dodged Enkrid's attack and leapt over him. One of the needles struck her cloak, followed swiftly by the rest, all embedding into the fabric as she evaded them with precise movements. Watching her, Encrid couldn't help but question whether she had once been with the assassin. Yet now, she stood between them, a protector. Whatever the truth, this was his opportunity. He lunged forward in a long leap toward the fleeing enemy. The assassin, wide-eyed with fear, locked eyes with him. Encrid hurled his sword at the assassin, causing his adversary to reel in fury. Without hesitation, the assassin jumped back and fled. Encrid silently watched the tent's entrance, noting his enemy's escape. Observing the direction, Krang commented that the assassin was likely retreating for now. Encrid agreed, though a deeper question remained. Who had sent the assassin? Someone had to be paying for this, and whether the target was himself or vengeance, the truth needed uncovering. The fairy, sword in hand, offered a compliment to Encrid, acknowledging his speed and skill. As she sheathed her blade, Encrid studied her closely. Up until this moment, she had been an ally, but now she might not allow the truth to spread. Witnesses could not be left. Then Krang stepped forward, positioning himself between Encrid and the fairy. Addressing her directly, he made a request. He didn't want anyone to die that day. Encrid fell into silence, observing the exchange. The fairy, in turn, gave Krang a respectful bow and assured him that she would follow his wishes. Krang gestured to Vengeance, who still lay unconscious, and clarified that his request included the platoon commander as well. He asked if Vengeance was still alive. The fairy responded calmly that the antidote had been administered. He would survive. Considering her words, Enkrid realized she must be familiar with such remedies. Krang then stated that the situation needed to be cleaned up. If word of an assassin spread, it would create needless complications. Enkrid chimed in. He asked whether eliminating all traces would be enough. Enkrid suggested something, and Krang's gaze shifted toward Candle. There was a solution. The tent was set ablaze. As soldiers rushed toward the fire, shouting and trying to contain the flames, Enkrid laid Vengeance gently on the ground. Amid the cries of alarm, they declared there were 2 survivors. Watching the tent burn, Enkrid thought silently that the traces of the assassin had been erased. The rest could be managed. Midnight came, and the fairy and Krang passed quietly through the jungle. The fairy remarked that had the squad leader not delayed the enemy, he might have died. She asked if Krang had changed his mind because of Enkrid. Krang replied simply that he had, and then asked if she wasn't the least bit interested. The fairy turned away, offering no answer. Krang reflected that he'd been avoiding his fate for some times. Now he decided to face it. The morning sun rose as Enkrid's training for some time now. With the sun rising, Krang smiled and admitted that perhaps something had rubbed off on him. He called out to Enkrid's name, suggesting they'd meet again, each in their respective roles. Elsewhere, the scythe stood at the center of rippling water plain, fading gradually from sight. Enkrid stood upon the surface, watching as the old man appeared. The elder looked at him with a knowing expression, stating that they would meet again. Enkrid answered without hesitation, affirming that he would be ready any time. Under a sky partially veiled by clouds, Enkrid reflected on the repetition of these confrontations. He had survived that silent death once more and greeted another day. While packing, he noted that he could now sense the presence of most things, yet he still could not feel the fairy's presence. Much awaited him upon return, but thankfully he remained uninjured and ready to depart immediately. Rousing slowly, Vengeance asked why Enkrid saved him from the fire. A strange question, Enkrid thought, glancing at him. Was this his way of being troublesome about the rescue? Why the hostility? In response, Enkrid simply said they were comrades, and questioned whether any further reason was needed. Unsure, Vengeance looked at him in silence and murmured under his breath as Enkrid walked away. Then, hesitantly, Vengeance rose to his feet and asked if Enkrid was heading back to his squad. He warned him that the atmosphere out there was going to be unpleasant. Enkrid asked if something had happened. Vengeance explained that a rumor had begun to spread, one claiming the entire base was cursed. At the same time, Ragna, annoyed, struck Rem on the shoulder, provoking a confrontation. With sarcasm and aggression, Ragna hurled insults at Rem, who only smirked and lifted him off the ground. Other soldiers scattered as the fight escalated, shouting that the two were brawling again and wondering where their squad had gone wrong. Rem tossed Ragna into a tent, destroying in the process. Ragnar sprang to his feet, retaliating immediately. Rim countered with a brutal punch to Ragnar's face and then brandished his axe, threatening to destroy him. Chaos erupted as men screamed for others to take cover. Rim had drawn a weapon. Ragnar unsheathed his sword in turn, promising to split Rim in two. Amid the shouting and confusion, someone yelled about missing comrades. The madness unfolded unchecked. Enkrid arrived at the scene, observing the destruction. He had no idea whether the base was cursed, but the mayhem brought by these lunatics might well be the true curse. He cursed at them loudly, ordering them to stop. In response, the others speculated whether he had already died or gone insane. Enkrid replied bitterly that he had not died, though losing his mind from their antics remained a strong possibility. As the sun continued to rise, Enkrid lay down on his bed and shut his eyes. For days had passed since his return to the squad. His eyes flew open as Jackson approached by. Jackson commented that he had been trying to leave without waking anyone and asked if Enkrid had been disturbed. Rising from the bed, Enkrid said he had been about to get up and exercise anyway. Jackson noted his progress, admitting that although Enkrid had only recently started, he was already becoming quite skilled at listening. Enkrid credited his steady practice. Jackson encouraged him to keep training, explaining that it will help someday. With winter drawing near, battles had become increasingly rare. Enkrid gripped a tree branch, pulling himself upward with steady discipline. This lull in combat, he reasoned, was time he could not afford to waste. It had to be used for training. One of the squad members greeted him, referring to him as Brother Squad Leader. Nearby, Auden was deep in his own routine, performing push-ups with a large stone balanced on his back. Auden asked whether Enkrid had just returned from his morning session, commenting on how consistent he had been. Enkrid replied that he was doing well enough. Auden rose, setting the stone aside. Auden rose, setting the stone aside, and Enkrid watched with surprise as the shadow of Auden's figure stretched across his face. Auden remarked that a well-trained body was a weapon in itself, and added that anyone aiming for excellence should at least be able to withstand a kick from Frog. He noted that Enkrid was still too thin and urged him to continue training. Thinking silently, Enkrid expressed that Auden was simply too large, thus he stated that he will try. Auden explained that improvement never stopped and reminded Enkrid of the training methods they had discussed earlier inside the tent. Meanwhile, in that same tent, Rim flipped the bed, sending Ragnar tumbling to the floor. Filled with irritation, Rim demanded to know why Ragnar was still asleep despite it being his turn for duty. Ragnar crawled out from beneath the bed, grabbing his sword and lifting it as if ready to retaliate. In return, Rim reached for his axe in preparation for their clash. Enkrid entered with Auden, immediately noticing the commotion and asking if another fight had broken out. He ordered both to cut it out, while Auden, holding his cross, chimed in that wanton violence solved nothing. Rim pointed his thumb at Ragnar and accused him of trying to starve them. Enkrid addressed Ragnar directly, reminding him that if it was his shift, he needed to start cooking. Ragnar glanced away indifferently and said he would do it if ordered. Still glaring, Rim told Ragnar not to act indifferent if he was going to do it anyway. Ragnar strolled off, brushing past Rim, who sniffed at a scrap of cloth and commented on his unpleasant scent. Enkrid warned Rim to stop picking fights unnecessarily and asked whether boredom was the cause. Rim looked at him in surprise, asking if he had truly noticed. The lack of combat had left him restless, itching for something. Enkrid advised him not to take it out on others and suggested they duel instead. Black clouds gathered over the sun. During the bout, Rim landed a punch to Enkrid's ribs. Raising his axe, he mocked him, saying he needed to toughen up. As the next blow came, Enkrid focused on staying calm, recalling the rhythm of the heart of the beast. He blocked with his sword, noting that all his past deaths had sharpened his ability to react using sound. His specialty, honed over 100 trials, was the stab. He thrust toward Rim's neck. Rim pulled back, evading the strike, and struck with his axe. Grabbing Enkrid by the collar, he slammed him to the ground, disappointed. Enkrid looked up in surprise. Rim commented that he had expected more, considering Enkrid's recent progress. Rim asked what made him boring all of a sudden. Rim explained that using the same stab again and again was tiresome, and asked whether he had anything new to offer. Using his sword to stand, Enkrid reflected on how far he had come. He was no longer the same. Now he could repeat a technique hundreds, even thousands of times to reach his goal. He asked Rim to come at him again. This time, he would break through. Rim watched him in silence. Though he still found Enkrid's technique lacking, the determination in those eyes struck him. He admitted to himself that boredom wouldn't come easily if that fire remained. He challenged Enkrid to prove his threat by leaving a mark. Rain suddenly began to fall. They both paused, glancing skyward in surprise. At the camp's edge, Enkrid stood under the awning, gazing out. The rain fell and halted as it pleased. Looking down at his foot, Rim commented that mushrooms might soon grow from it. Inside the camp, Ragna dozed while Auden knelt in prayer, clutching his cross. Cries burst in, soaked and frustrated, hauling his belongings. He yelled about the endless delays to their duel and ruffled his wet hair, joking that someone must have cursed them. Enkrid asked about the curse. Astonished, Cries asked whether he hadn't heard the rumors. Memories stirred. Vengeance had mentioned something about a cursed encampment. Cries sat down, toweling off, muttering about the strange weather and increased casualties. Fires had broken out often, especially among the scout units. Jack, Bo, and Rotten were all injured. Whispers of a curse had spread, fueled by these events. Yet Cries remained skeptical, believing the erratic weather was simply feeding the paranoia. Enkrid replied that the higher-ups wouldn't ignore such developments. Cries then asked why he was standing at the entrance. Enkrid answered that he was training his senses. Cries questioned why he would do so during a downpour, and Enkrid responded that the downpour was precisely the reason. Rim burst in, accusing him of behaving like a stray cat surviving on scraps. Jackson interjected, saying it was actually a smart way to train, and commended Enkrid's efforts. Irked, Rim questioned when Jackson started caring about their leader or teaching him anything. Eyes still on the world beyond the tent, Enkrid thought their voices had become so loud he could no longer hear the rain. Auden addressed Rim, saying that even inside the tent, there were ways to train while lying down. Ragna added a sarcastic remark, asking if Rim needed him to check his stance again. Rim looked around, realizing with a grimace that everyone had caught on. Jackson watched silently. Auden offered a smile, while Ragna observed without a word. Rim, too, wore a slight smile as he glanced at Enkrid, who stood gazing out of the tent. A meeting gathered at the main camp. Voices rose as someone urged the company commanders to keep their soldiers under control. At the head of the assembly stood their apparent leader, addressing the others with a composed tone. Alongside him sat the fairy, and together they discussed preparations for the approaching winter. The leader proposed deploying a scouting party and invited suggestions to fill existing gaps. The fairy offered a name, the leader of the 444th Squad. The commander raised an eyebrow, questioning whether the one she spoke of was not just a simple-minded fool or perhaps someone who would only hinder the scouts. She countered calmly, suggesting that he might yield unexpected results. When asked why she believed that, she stood and declared that it was merely a fairy's instinct. After the rain, Enkrid approached the fairy, asking whether he was truly being assigned to the scouts. The fairy looked at him in mild surprise. Sometime later, Cries asked if Enkrid had offended the company commander somehow. While preparing for the assignment, Enkrid replied that he had no idea what could have caused that. Cries wondered aloud what other reason there could be for choosing someone like him. Recalling the fairy's expression, Enkrid considered that she likely wouldn't kill him, and now that Krang had departed, perhaps that changed things. Holding his axe and polishing it casually, Rim asked if Enkrid was really going. He even offered to help him escape. Enkrid brushed it off, stating that he couldn't exactly use that axe on a superior officer. Rim replied that he wouldn't suggest anything so reckless. Enkrid warned him not to try it anyway, and reminded him of his history with such behavior. At that moment, Auden appeared, holding his cross and mumbling a prayer, asking why God tested his poor servants so harshly. He begged not to take away their precious little squad leader. Noting all of this, Enkrid wondered what exactly had gotten into everyone. Ragnar stood abruptly and told Enkrid he would take his place if it came to that. However, he clarified that while others might fit the role, he could not. Rim turned to Ragnar, scoffing and asking if he was planning to get lost. Cleaning his dagger, Jackson mentioned Encrid's assignment to scout the tall grass fields. He advised him to listen carefully for changes in how the grass moved, to focus on disturbances. That, he explained, was the first step in detecting and countering an ambush. Clearly irritated, Rem snapped at Jackson, accusing him of teaching Enkrid again, and warned him to stop feeding him strange ideas. Enkrid looked at the two and reflected that once he was gone, no one would be able to stop them from fighting. He questioned whether it was right to leave them here. Despite that, he knew the truth. No one else was more suited for this mission than himself. Sitting on a wooden stool and wrapping cloth around his arms, he thought back. Since enlistment, he had drifted from one position to another due to his mediocre skills, always filling roles others had vacated. Back in the tent, Rem raised his axe again while Jackson lifted his dagger. Their standoff halted the moment Enkrid entered. Both froze, caught mid-conflict, as Enkrid silently stepped between them. Looking at them, he acknowledged to himself that the only place he had truly proved useful was as the leader of a ragtag squad. He gently pushed Rem's axe down and told him to knock it off. Rem asked whether Enkrid was stupid or brave. Jackson, turning away, told Rem to be grateful. Otherwise, he'd have ended up with another hole in his heart. Rem, in turn, retorted that Jackson's head would have come off first. Listening, Enkrid considered their strength. Both were too skilled to lose. Compared to them, his own combat ability didn't measure up. But that wasn't the point. He knew where he stood. All that mattered was getting stronger. The next day, the scout squad moved through the jungle. Among them walked Enkrid, pondering how the scouts would soon be stationed at the front lines. The time could be used to refine his senses. A brown-haired man glared at Enkrid and snapped at him to stay focused. He is Andrew Gardner, leader of the scout squad. Though they shared rank, Andrew emphasized that he was in charge here. If there was a problem, they could settle it with a fight. A black-haired man chimed in, mocking Enkrid. He asked Andrew if he even had the courage to face off, scoffing that Enkrid came from the infamous outcast squad. Another added that Enkrid probably didn't even know how to hold a sword. Andrew claimed that if Enkrid did fight him, he wouldn't be harmed. His squad only succeeded because of the members, not him. He boldly declared that if they encountered the enemy, his unit would crush their skulls. Hearing this, Enkrid realized that these men had no grasp of what scouting truly meant. Their squad leader was green, completely unfit. Doubt crept in. Would this mission go well? A moment later, they found a track. Andrew crouched beside it, pointing out footprints in the mud. After inspecting closely, he confirmed they were fresh. He declared they should follow them and joked about a barbecue later. Enkrid examined the same trail. His instincts told him these were the tracks of news, creatures that never traveled in groups smaller than 20. If they pursued them now, a real battle would break out. A long, green-haired man laughed and dismissed Enkrid's concern, claiming the tracks belonged to Gazelle. Smiling, he called the squad leader overly sensitive. The man is Henri. He was a hunter in a mountain town. Henry showed little regard for the squad leader, yet he struck up a conversation with Enkrid. Their talks quickly turned casual, and over time they grew closer, often discussing the fundamentals of hunting, information that Enkrid found unexpectedly valuable. Henry explained that animals typically followed separate trails through these grasslands and promised to share more details the next day. Under the bright moonlight, Andrew reflected on the day they had spent combing the area for non-existent news. The scout squad's entire day had been wasted. Pacing around, he was frustrated, running his hand through his hair, acknowledging that the tracks had certainly been fresh, but insisting that results were needed. Morning arrived. As the squad marched through the expansive fields, Henry pointed out the location they had been tasked with recon is the Green Pearl. The grass there stood tall and wild, serving no apparent purpose. The squad examined the dense foliage, and Andrew stepped forward, declaring that they would push through this field, locate the enemy scouting party, and capture them for reward. The squad pressed into the swaying grass. With growing apprehension, Henry asked whether they were truly expected to enter the field or if the plan had only been to survey it from a distance. Enkrid answered that they were following the squad leader's orders. They advanced through the dense terrain, and Enkrid noted that moving through the underbrush was no easy task. He half expected Andrew to tire quickly and complain, but to his surprise, The squad leader remained serious and silent. Henry glanced around and remarked on the noticeable lack of animal droppings. Brushing back a layer of grass, Enkrid asked whether that was a problem. Henry confirmed it was. There should have been animals in an area rich with food, yet none were present. Suddenly, a dark paw pressed into the soil. A black panther emerged from the tall grass. Enkrid turned to see the beast glaring at him. He shoved both himself and Andrew to the ground as sharp, needle-like wooden stakes shot through, impaling 3 scout members. Andrew looked back and saw massed enemies rising. He shouted for everyone to flee. 2 more scouts were caught and killed. Enkrid turned to see 2 enemies pursuing him. Others now rose from the tall grass, surrounding them. Enkrid sprinted through the thinning grass, desperate to escape his relentless pursuers. Arrows soared through the air, sharp and unrelenting, thudding into the earth beside him. Enkrid recalled the listening technique Jackson had taught him. It had proven surprisingly useful, allowing him to anticipate incoming attacks with uncanny precision. His body reacted before his mind fully registered the danger, tilting just in time to avoid a cluster of arrows aimed directly at him. Yet even with the technique aiding him, something strange echoed in his ears, an odd, continuous noise that grated against his senses. It made no sense. There was no clear source, no enemy movement to track, but it heightened his awareness nonetheless, sharpening his instincts as he pushed forward. The arrows came again, slicing through the wind. This time, several struck home, embedding deep in his upper torso. Pain flared. He staggered, stunned by the sheer number of projectiles. A thought surfaced through the agony. They would be ambushed. The signs were all there. Logically, he should try to avoid the ambush tomorrow. But the next day played out exactly as the last. Time repeated, dragging him into the same conflict. This time, Enkrid tried to talk to Andrew. In return, Andrew clenched his sword and turned toward Enkrid, demanding to know what he had just said. He was enraged that Enkrid tried to challenge his authority. Enkrid already knew the answer. Reasoning with them was a dead end. They would never listen. If survival was the goal, perhaps he needed to find a way to escape on his own. As evening fell, they ran again. Blades flashed in the tall grass. Enkrid moved along a new route this time, hoping to evade detection, but his effort was futile. The enemy intercepted him once more. Steel stabbed into his side. Still, he clung to a single truth: he had tomorrow. The day would repeat. He just had to try again. And again he died. Arrows found him like they had so many times before. He counted at least 20, shot by crossbowmen stationed eastward. The next iteration, he veered north in an effort to avoid the crossbow trap. But there, a squad of spearmen waited. They closed in swiftly. Dropping to the earth, he clenched a handful of soil, listening to the enemy shout commands to search the area. They knew he was near. His eyes followed their movements, noting their uniforms, dyed a deep green, perfectly matched to the grasslands. They had come prepared. This wasn't a coincidence. Pain flared again. As his strength drained, he wondered what in this empty field warranted such intense defense. Hidden among the grass, he glimpsed it, a concealed camp. His eyes widened. Before he could act on the discovery, a shadow loomed. A soldier raised a blade and brought it down on Enkrid's back. As life left his body, his final thoughts clung to that camp and whatever secret it held. Time turned again. The morning brought Andrew's familiar speech, word for word, a call to action. They would cross the grassland, locate the hostile force, and bring back prisoners to claim their reward. Enkrid stared into the distance, detached. That same plan had failed countless times. The result never changed. Death awaited them every time. They were marching towards something hidden, something lethal. If he abandoned that objective, he wouldn't have to die. Maybe giving up was the path to survival. A voice called his name. Henry from behind. Enkrid turned slightly, considering that this might be the last time he allowed the day to repeat without change. There would be no more running from this unseen wall. Andrew barked his name again, demanding to know what he was waiting for. The small bearded soldier glanced at Enkrid, understanding something had shifted. Still, he followed orders. Their squad leader carried burdens of his own, but when he began to speak, Encrid cut him off. There was no reason to obey anymore. Respect had limits, and the squad leader had long since crossed them. He questioned aloud how much more verbal abuse they were all willing to tolerate. His voice carried defiance. The bearded soldier stared at him, stunned, and asked what he had just said. Enkrid stepped past him, making it clear that he was finished playing by their rules. Andrew turned sharply, asking if this meant defiance, if Enkrid was disobeying orders. The thought crossed Enkrid's mind again. Alone, he wouldn't last. He needed them, but not like this. He replied that it wasn't disobedience. From now on, he would be the one giving orders. Survival demanded it. Andrew's glare sharpened as Enkrid observed the group. Of them, Andrew, Henry, and the bearded soldier typically survived the longest. That fact mattered. The bearded one, especially, fought with tenacity. He never left Andrew's side, likely his bodyguard. Andrew unsheathed his weapon and challenged him. If Enkrid wanted to lead, he'd have to prove he could defeat him. Analyzing Andrew's stance, Enkrid recognized formal training. Fluid, composed, purposeful. This wasn't a common soldier. Yet the lack of real combat experience revealed itself in his careless aggression. The conclusion was clear: a fallen noble, eager to prove something. That explained the urgency. Memories surfaced, moments when Enkrid had suspected as much. Someone desperate for results wouldn't behave this recklessly unless their position was suggesting as such. Andrew lashed out with insult, accusing Enkrid of being a pampered officer with an inflated title. Useless and weak. Enkrid dismissed the comment. Whatever Andrew was, he no longer deserved to lead. That was final. Andrew insisted again that he had a mission. Enkrid cut him off once more, mocking his verbosity. With a flick of his hand, he signaled for Andrew to come forward. No sword would be needed. Andrew charged. Enkrid braced himself. Under normal conditions, a fighter like Andrew would pose a real threat. But arrogance dulled his precision, and Andrew underestimated him. As the enemy closed the distance, Enkrid shifted. With swift, decisive movements, he blocked the incoming attack, twisted, and landed a hard elbow strike into Andrew's abdomen. Surprise spread across Andrew's face as the blow connected. Andrew collapsed with a sharp cry, pain twisting his face as he hit the ground. Saliva flew from his mouth, and he gritted his teeth while trying to breathe. The small bearded soldier, eyes wide, muttered in disbelief that Andrew had gone down from a single blow. Equally stunned, Henry remarked that he had heard Enkrid was supposed to be from the bottom of the barrel. Enkrid turned his gaze across them all and announced that, from this point on, the squad would operate under his command. He asked if anyone had objections. Henry remained silent, watching him with uncertain eyes. The bearded soldier lowered his head without a word. Still struggling to stand, Andrew said nothing. A sigh escaped the bearded man's lips, accepting the outcome. Enkrid looked at them, reading their silence as agreement. This was step one. As evening fell, the squad trailed Enkrid quietly. One of them eventually asked what he had on his mind. In response, Enkrid turned to Henry and asked about his dream. Henry blinked, taken aback by the question, then asked why it mattered. A moment later, he admitted that he dreamed of marrying a beautiful woman who ran a flower shop. Enkrid told him in order to achieve that dream, survival was a requirement. Enkrid then turned to the soldier behind him and asked about his dream. The man replied that his lover had recently given birth. Enkrid told him bluntly that if he didn't want his child growing up fatherless, he'd need to make it out alive too. Then he looked to another scout and asked the same question. One answered that he wanted to save up enough to start his own business. Another said simply that he wanted to go home. Finally, Enkrid turned to Andrew and asked him as well. Andrew replied that his dream was tied to his late mother. He had a mission to fulfill and wished to restore the House of Gardner. Enkrid responded dryly that all their dreams shared a common requirement: survival. And if any of them truly wished to realize their goals, they would have to live through the day. Silence followed. The group stared at him, thoughtful. Before they could delve deeper into what had just been said, Enkrid urged them to focus on making it out alive. They stared wordlessly at him, But Enkrid thought to himself that what he truly needed from them now was proactivity. Nothing motivated better than the promise of life. But the enemy would appear soon. Plans were already in motion. He raised his arm and pointed toward the fields ahead, instructing Henry to fire an arrow in that direction. When Henry hesitated, Enkrid reminded him coldly that he would not repeat himself. The arrow was loosed. It struck true, hitting one of the hidden enemies. Another enemy shouted in panic, "An ambush." The scout squad responded immediately. They shouted that enemies were near, and Enkrid, drawing his blade, charged forward, ordering Andrew to follow. Andrew unsheathed his sword in frustration and joined the charge. Enkrid knew that to gain the upper hand, they had to strike first and hard. Surprise was their only real advantage. Enemies surged toward them, prepared to fight, but Enkrid moved swiftly and stabbed one in the back. He then turned, ready to press forward. One of the enemy soldiers, upon spotting him, screamed to his comrades to kill them all. Before the order could take effect, Andrew appeared behind him and struck him down. Enkrid thought quickly. Confusion had taken hold of the enemy. It was their best chance to cut down as many as possible. Bringing Andrew meant bringing his bodyguard along too, and with both of them, the odds were turning in their favor. The squad moved as one, silent, deadly, efficient. One by one, the enemy forces fell. Their initial number, 12, had already been reduced to 8. The survivors began to shout that they were under ambush. One asked how many attackers there were, but there was no time to answer. The squad advanced and engaged the next line. Enkrid gave the order, eliminate them all. They executed the front line instantly, catching them completely off guard. The tall grass concealed their positions just as well as it did the enemies. Enkrid reflected that the main reason they had been discovered in past cycles was likely due to something else. Then, suddenly, an animal bolted out of the grass. A black panther. The enemy froze at the sight. The beast stared poised. One of the enemy's soldiers lunged forward to spear it. Enkrid appeared and cut him down in a flash. The realization struck. This was the same beast from the first cycle. They had been chasing it and had stumbled upon the enemy by accident. Enkrid's eyes lingered on the creature. Its unexpected presence had caused just enough disruption to keep their ambush undetected. He couldn't allow it to die easily. Not now, Henry called out, announcing the area was clear. Enkrid ordered immediate movement. The panther followed briefly, but when it noticed the group's path, it slipped into hiding. Enkrid's thoughts turned grim. One casualty. That left 6 survivors, more than any previous attempt. Even after repeating this cycle countless times, preserving everyone had proven impossible. Yet this, right now, was the best outcome so far. A lone enemy, spear in hand, stood frozen in fear. Enkrid appeared behind him and ended him without hesitation. He now knew the enemy's positions, their numbers, their behavior. Ahead, a deadly trap of 30 crossbowmen waited. If they continued straight, they would be slaughtered. He sprinted ahead, signaling a turn to the right. That would bypass the ambush. The spearmen who doggedly chased them in every cycle also had to be dealt with quickly. They were a constant threat to any escape attempt. Avoid direct confrontation. Strike, then vanish. Hit and run. That was the only way to shatter the encirclement. Andrew drove a blade through the chest of one enemy. Watching him, the bearded man thought he was pushing himself too hard. Darkness would soon fall, and if they hadn't escaped by then, they'd lose their path. He warned that they had to get out before sunset. Enkrid answered him firmly. They were going forward. The small bearded man pointed out that they were pushing deeper into hostile territory. Enkrid acknowledged this, affirming that they were on the correct path and declaring that he would not entertain objections. The bearded man stared at him without speaking. Both Andrew and Henry turned sharply when the man stepped forward and unsheathed his sword in front of Enkrid. His voice carried weight as he called him captain and made his intentions clear. He had no desire to follow someone blindly to death. If survival required it, he would cut down even his leader. Enkrid met his gaze without flinching. He stated plainly that it was already too late to turn back. The noise they had caused would have drawn the enemy, to block their retreat. There was no safe path in reverse. He asked if they intended to follow Enkrid instead. Then, reaching out, Enkrid grabbed the man's arm and insisted that clarity was needed. He explained that he, too, wanted to survive. The unexpected honesty silenced them. Andrew studied him, thoughts running deeper than the surface revealed. The squad leader he had thought of as useless, an echo of a memory. His father came to mind, drunken and broken, a man who had thrown away the legacy of their house. In the final moments of his life, that same father had told him that though their home might crumble, he still hoped his son would become someone who could lead simply by being present. He had urged him to earn trust, become someone others would follow, and rebuild what had been lost. Andrew remembered what kind of person he had always aspired to be. Encrid turned to the group and asked for their trust. He promised that they would survive this place. Andrew stepped forward and declared his trust in Encrid. He addressed him once again as captain. The bearded man opened his mouth to speak, but Andrew cut him off. The current captain was Encrid, and a squad obeyed its captain. Silence followed. Encrid lowered himself to the ground and told them all to follow him only once he gave the signal. They crouched low, quiet in the tall grass. In the stillness, Encrid considered the plan. The first step toward escaping the day was simple. Strike first. Ambush the enemy. Shatter the encirclement. They waited in silence, judging their surroundings. An enemy suddenly emerged, breaking the quiet. All around them, the tip of spears were spotted, scattered in different patterns, and protruded from the ground. Henry and his companion were startled by the discovery. Enkrid focused. The second step was the key. This location, this moment, only now, only here, after dozens of repetitions, this had become the turning point. Andrew and the bearded man scanned the area, alert. Enkrid noticed a few enemies ahead. Rather than confronting them, he chose to let them pass. The squad would press forward without alerting the others. Enemies stood in staggered formations, spears in hand. Some watched from the rear. The scouts followed closely, sweat on their brows, nerves frayed. Enkrid could feel their tension. The plan had held so far. This was the final step. The sun slipped below the horizon. Darkness swallowed the field. It was always at this point that failure seized them. He exhaled. The grass thinned. They had reached their destination. Henry gasped in disbelief. The man beside him groaned in regret. After so much effort, they had arrived at the enemy camp. Enkrid scanned the area. The soldiers of Aspen had constructed multiple camps, their intent clear. Every life in this field was being snuffed out to conceal something. Tattered flags fashioned from torn cloth rose above the encampments. Human skulls adorned the posts. Whatever lay here, it was meant to remain buried. A thought surfaced when something more vital than catching them demanded attention. A chance to escape would present itself. He ordered the squad to move. They took cover behind the enemy's tent. The bearded man, whispering, asked if Enkrid intended to set the camp ablaze. They were surrounded, after all. The danger of being discovered was real. Enkrid turned to him and asked his name. The man replied he could be called Mac. Enkrid warned that disobedience would not be tolerated. Mac looked ready to argue, but Andrew stopped him. Mac turned toward him in surprise. Enkrid was already moving. Mac followed, mentally noting that even without Andrew's reminder, there was no other option. The clouded moonlight offered no guidance. In such conditions, only the squad leader's path could be trusted. Enkrid slashed through a tent. Mac followed closely, frustrated by what he saw. Enkrid tearing through the fabric without hesitation. Inside, the tent was empty. They rushed through the encampment. Mac knew that this was reckless. They were in the heart of the enemy's stronghold, and yet no guards had appeared. That silence was unnatural. Despite the emptiness, there was no doubt they were inside enemy territory. Enkrid approached the flag, flanked by a few enemy soldiers. Raising his hand, he signaled for the squad to halt. His mind returned to earlier cycles. He had infiltrated this place many times before. The first time he had seen the flag, he had reached out to touch it. The reaction had been immediate. The entire enemy force had turned on him. Their priority wasn't pursuit. It was the flag. That piece of cloth was their secret. That was what they had buried in this field, what they were willing to kill, to protect. He considered aloud. What would happen if the flag caught fire? Mac, nearby, asked if he realized that the flag he spoke of was already standing before him. A sudden realization struck. What if the company commander had been the one to assign this unknown soldier to their squad? The possibility sent a chill through the air. Enkrid informed them plainly that the Aspen soldiers would be too preoccupied defending the flag to pursue them effectively. At the same moment, Max studied him, trying to make sense of why Enkrid had seized control of the squad and led them deep into enemy territory. It had to be a secret mission. That was the only explanation. Enkrid declared that the group would split into two teams, one to act as bait, the other to ignite the camp. Mac volunteered for the bait team. Taken aback, Enkrid stared at him in silence. For someone who had complained so much, his sudden cooperation was unexpected, but welcome. He watched Mac approach Henry and reflected on the pattern. He had led the squad into this encampment many times across different cycles, but never with this many people still alive. Today had been their best attempt yet, and it felt like things might finally change. A soldier's head snapped back, struck by a rock. His companion, spotting Max sprinting away, shouted out a warning of intruders. The enemy scrambled after them, racing toward a standing torch. Enkrid felt the momentum. This time he would succeed. He would make it to tomorrow. He grasped the fire stick firmly, ready to set the blaze and trigger the next step, until a figure appeared before him. Without warning, the man raised his sword and cut the torch in Enkrid's grasp. Shock rippled through Enkrid. He hadn't heard the man's approach at all. Worse, he didn't recognize this enemy. This was someone new, someone who hadn't appeared in any of the other cycles. Silent and tense, Enkrid tried to process where such a skilled opponent had come from. The man insulted him coldly, and then casually returned his sword to its sheath. Enkrid retorted that the others were late. The man cast a disdainful glare at him, surprised as to what he was suggesting. Behind them, a nearby tent burst into flames. Shouts rose among the enemy ranks. There was fire, and the tents were catching. A soldier pointed at Andrew and another scout, crying out that more intruders had appeared. The soldier in front of Enkrid barked a command to put out the flames. Enkrid assessed the situation quickly. Mac had succeeded in drawing away most of the enemy forces. He had drawn the attention of the first enemy group, and Andrew had lit the fires as planned. Now, all that remained was to escape. He stomped his foot into the ground, focusing. All attacks, he reminded himself, began from the ground. Pointing his blade, he commanded his body to move. With every ounce of control, he launched forward, aiming to exploit the opening in the enemy's defense. But the man turned just in time. Enkrid's eyes widened. He passed him, missing the vital strike. Blood oozed from a gash on his abdomen. Pain racked him. That had been his cleanest strike. Thus, he knew he cannot beat him. The man regarded him with a mix of scorn and disappointment, calling him weak. Enkrid recognized the truth. At his current level, he couldn't win. The skill gap was undeniable. Everything, every cycle, every death had led to this moment, and he still wasn't strong enough. The man now stood like a wall in the center of this cursed day. If Enkrid challenged him recklessly, he would die again, wasting everything. The squad would scatter. The loop would reset, and he would be forced to relive these meaningless deaths once more. But no, Enkrid refused to give up. He did not want to. The man studied him, taken aback. He asked if Enkrid was laughing. Enkrid met his gaze and laughed arrogantly, defiant even in the face of death. The enemy charged, roaring that he would cut him down. Enkrid steadied his weapon, focusing his will. He would overcome this wall. Steel clashed. The curly-haired man met Enkrid's blade with full force. Sparks danced in the firelight. Enkrid reeled. His strike had been parried. The man leapt, sword poised to kill. Enkrid twisted away, barely avoiding the blow. The enemy's blade struck the ground. Another slash came for Enkrid's neck. He bent backward just in time. From that low position, the man struck upward again. Enkrid, already strained, raised his blade to block, only to be knocked backward from the impact. Terror filled him. The man was fast, accurate, unrelenting. Enkrid had no opening for a counterattack, no room to breathe. Another strike lifted his sword from his hands. It clattered to the ground. The man raised his weapon again. Enkrid tried to resist, but the man deflected the blade with the back of his hand. Then, moving forward swiftly, he drove the sword into Enkrid's chest. A cry rang out. Someone yelled that the fire was spreading. The man's blade dragged past Enkrid's ears as flames surged nearby. Voices shouted that oil had been poured. Fire raced toward the flag. A soldier called out to the man, addressing him as platoon commander. Urgently, he asked what to do. The flag was at risk. The platoon leader turned to Enkrid. A flicker of realization crossed his face. He understood now. Enkrid would not fall so easily. Enkrid stared in disbelief, eyes narrowing as the man glanced back at him. An expression void of concern, as if this encounter meant nothing. Enkrid hadn't expected to see someone like him, not this soon, not here. As the man turned away, Enkrid wondered if he was retreating so easily. He watched him issue commands to subordinates and questioned whether this individual was the true wall of today. If he wasn't, then the one Enkrid truly needed to overcome still awaited. And Drew called out, sprinting toward him. Urgency in his voice. He insisted they had to move immediately. The enemy platoon's commander changed his priority to save the flag, no matter what. As he walked, the commander turned his gaze back and made sure to remember Enkrid's face. Enkrid looked at him, insolence in his gaze, then returned his sword to its sheath and raised his voice. He declared that the squad was retreating. Behind them, the flames now still raging on the enemy's flag. The squad fled through the grasslands, embers and smoke behind them. Enkrid glanced at Mac and Henry, noting the absence of one of their comrades who probably had perished. Only 5 remained in the squad. Mac asked if this was the end, if a large-scale pursuit wouldn't be dispatched after them. Enkrid responded that it seemed unlikely. Henry stumbled, coughing and clutching his side. From behind, shouts echoed. The enemy hadn't entirely given up. They chased with renewed fury, demanding none escape alive. The scout squad turned, blades drawn. Enkrid sliced through an approaching enemy, severing his head. Mac plunged his weapon into another's neck. Andrew cleaved through his own attacker. Enkrid urged them not to hesitate and to keep pushing forward. Strained but steady, Henry called out that if they kept moving toward the fox and snake habitat, the pursuit would struggle to follow. A soldier supporting Henry pointed out that the terrain would make it harder for them too. But Henry assured them he knew a route, a hunter's path. Enkrid, placing trust in him, asked him to guide them. As morning crept over the horizon, the sounds of pursuit finally faded. The squad pressed on, feet thudding through wild terrain. A fox stood silently behind, watching them pass. Enkrid thought to himself that it had taken every member's effort to reach this point. Andrew and Mac's diversion, Henry's pathfinding. Without any of them, escape would have been impossible. They emerged from the tall grass, lights streaking across the sky. At the edge of the field, stationed soldiers looked up in astonishment as the battered scout squad appeared. One of the guards called out in confusion, asking what had happened. Exhausted, Henry muttered that he was ready to collapse. Enkrid breathed heavily and thought to himself that yet another day had passed. A new one had dawned. Elsewhere, within Aspen's secret encampment, blackened tents smoldered and the air hung thick with smoke. A middle-aged, blond-haired man stood among the wreckage. He asked about the flag. Embarrassed, his subordinate admitted they would need to prepare another. The commander muttered that he hadn't expected the renowned Grey Dog to be caught off guard, especially by such a small force. His gaze settled on the charred remnants of the flag. He found it incomprehensible. The soldiers stationed at the tall grass field had been among the best. Yet somehow, a handful of enemies had launched an attack, ignited the camp, and escaped. It was explained that Grey Dog was an independent company, operating under its own command, named after the relentless Grey Dog of the Aspen Principality, an animal known for never releasing its target once chosen. The soldiers were similarly tenacious. Their reputation had earned them the nickname Persistent Lovers. The company leader turned to his subordinate and asked if he had faced the strongest among them. The platoon leader, Mitch Hurrier, replied that if not for the fire, the encounter might have ended differently. The commander acknowledged that luck was sometimes its own kind of skill. Mitch promised it wouldn't happen again. Back at the medical camp, Enkrid sat quietly on a stool, binding a wound on his arm. His thoughts drifted back to the one he'd faced, a wall he had failed to overcome. The frustration gnawed at him. He had wanted to keep fighting. Just as persistent, at the enemy's camp, Mitch promised the commander that next time, he would kill that man with his own hands. Thus, the persistent lovers had chosen their next target. Seated in silence, Enkrid vowed that next time, he would surpass him. At the fourth camp, Rem played an axe with a sigh, lamenting his boredom. The squad leader was supposed to return soon, yet there had been no word. He grumbled to himself, then stood, holding the axe from its tip. Though he had improved recently, he still considered himself too small. Death wouldn't be surprising. He admitted it didn't happen often, but he liked the squad leader. He wondered aloud what could be done if he really died. With a helpless shrug, he noted that nothing felt interesting anymore. Nearby, Ragna yawned and looked over in irritation, catching Rem's stare. He snapped at him, asking what he was looking at. In reply, Rem calmly raised his middle finger. Ragna did the same, mirroring the gesture. Rem grinned, calling out that he knew Ragna wanted to kill him. Drawing his sword, Ragna responded with an insult. Within the commander's tent, the fairy spoke with Enkrid, summarizing his actions. She stated that Enkrid had, by chance, uncovered an enemy ambush, infiltrated their base, and, while he was at it, managed to burn it down. Enkrid responded that in each moment he had chosen the best possible course, and that luck had been on their side. Skeptical, the fairy studied him for a long moment. Then, she told him to rest and recover. As Enkrid bowed respectfully, she thought to herself that she had hoped to achieve something with him, but had never expected anything quite like this, especially not from someone like him. Enkrid stepped outside, thoughts clouded with uncertainty. He still couldn't quite grasp what she was truly thinking. But his thoughts halted when Andrew approached and bowed his head, apologizing for his earlier behavior. Andrew then expressed his gratitude and asked if they might meet again someday. Enkrid passed by, waving his hand casually, and replied that if their paths crossed again, so be it. Andrew and Max silently watched him leave. Andrew offered a final respectful bow. The others followed suit. Enkrid moved forward, aware that their survival today had been possible because of him. He had managed to return with 4 of them. Yet, despite that success, 2 squad members had been lost. That outcome lingered heavily. Had he been just a little stronger, perhaps he could have saved them too. But this cycle, the repetition of this very day, allowed him to look beyond his limitations. He would no longer merely struggle to survive. His purpose was now clear, to become a knight. These repeating days would serve as his stepping stones. And to break free from this endless loop, he had to grow stronger. Enkrid's attention shifted at the sound of voices shouting. Some squad members had gathered, watching Rem and Ragna in yet another fight. Enkrid stared at them curiously. They stood face to face, with their expressions of intensity. Though he had sparred with both many times, he had never seen them like this. A red-haired soldier muttered that they were more beasts than men. Enkrid stepped closer, observing their locked gazes. It struck him, perhaps they had never gone all out against him. He gripped his sword and reminded himself to set his priorities straight. His first goal was simple: make them show those same faces when facing him. Rem launched an attack toward Ragna, who blocked it with his sword. Ragna glanced at Enkrid in surprise. Noticing him as well, Rem barked that he should report them now that he had returned, questioning why he was hiding like a cat. Frustrated, Rem began shouting, scattering those nearby. Ragna asked if Enkrid was hurt. Enkrid responded that it was only a scratch. When he asked Rem about the moment he blocked Ragna's strike earlier, Rem glanced away and dismissed the topic, telling him to go wash and rest. Ragna turned around when Enkrid asked about his last attack. Ragna simply turned his face without answering. Enkrid noticed the hesitation, but decided to leave it at that. If Ragna had something to say, he would speak when ready. With knowledge of the enemy's ambush patterns, the battalion commander moved the entire battalion closer to the tall grass field. Enkrid had recovered significantly during the journey. He had spent much of that time reflecting on his battles and refining his training. Later, as Kryze took a bite of food, he spotted Enkrid nearby, already wearing a shirt and preparing to train again. He asked why Enkrid didn't rest, especially since they were scheduled to move out the next day. Enkrid simply stated that he would be gone for a bit. Scoping soup into a bowl, Rem commented that training again in that condition was reckless. If he kept pushing like that, he would only die faster. With the sun already rising, Ragna stirred from sleep, awakened by the sound of a blade cutting through the morning air. Sitting up, he realized that Enkrid was at it again. Stretching and reaching for his sword, Ragna yawned and thought to himself that improving with the sword wasn't particularly difficult. There was even a chance to become a knight, though he found the whole concept dull. Ragna questioned the point of becoming a knight. What purpose would it serve? Why devote energy to a title he found no meaning in? That thought led him to stagnation. Meanwhile, Enkrid trained alone, his strikes fluid yet weighted with frustration. Ragna stepped outside and observed Enkrid's form. Suddenly, Enkrid stumbled and dropped to his knees, breathing heavily. From the sidelines, Ragna assessed his movements and concluded that Enkrid had built his technique on weak fundamentals. No amount of shortcuts would compensate for that. But if those basics were relearned, then even flawed training could still produce strength. Enkrid gripped his sword tightly, eyes locked forward with determination. Studying him, Ragna wondered aloud why he pushed himself so hard. When asked directly, Enkrid answered that his reason was simple. He wanted to become stronger. Ragna followed with another question. What would he do after gaining that strength? Enkrid replied that he wanted to become a knight. Ragna challenged the idea, stating that a knight was just someone who fought well. He asked if that title held much value to him. Enkrid explained what it meant to him. A knight was someone who made his own decisions about what was right. Someone who raised his sword for honor, for the sick and poor, and for those he loved. Listening, Ragna contemplated the meaning behind words like honor and merit. Perhaps strength was nothing more than a tool. He rested his sword on his shoulder, wondering what it was that he truly wanted. Taking a step forward, he thought that he wouldn't know the answer until he walked that path himself. Calling out to Enkrid, Ragna caught his attention. Enkrid turned toward him, curiosity in his eyes. Ragna asked him if he wanted to learn the sword. Enkrid confirmed the question, prompting Ragna to let out a weary sigh. Gazing upward, Ragna immediately regretted having spoken at all, sensing a creeping laziness already taking hold. As his eyes drifted to Enkrid, he noted something intriguing in the expression on his captain's face. Turning his attention to his fingers, Ragna inquired whether Rem had ever taught him about what he called the intestine of the beast. Enkrid corrected him, stating it was the heart of the beast, not the intestine. With it, Ragna explained that Enkrid needed to get rid of everything beside the heart of the beast and his stab. The response stunned Enkrid, who asked whether that included the Valen mercenary sword technique. Ragna emphasized that especially that technique had to go. Leaning heavily on the hilt of his sword, Ragna explained that holding on to old habits would only sabotage new learning. Even if Enkrid managed to pick up a few new techniques, he would simply fall back into familiar patterns. In that case, it would be better to quit altogether. The only real choice was to start from scratch or settle into mediocrity. Before Ragna could continue, Enkrid cut in with determination, declaring that he would begin again. Ragna turned to him, genuinely surprised, and asked whether he truly meant it. Without flinching, Enkrid responded with a counter-question. What should he do first? Lifting his head slightly, Ragna observed him with a strange calm and concluded internally that Enkrid was far from normal. Judging by his solid frame, Enkrid had no need for a light weapon. A long sword would suit him far better. Ragna proposed a weapon swap and gave pointers on form. Enkrid asked if it was correct to hang the sword that way, to which Ragna responded that it was nothing special. He demonstrated by placing his right hand above the left, adjusting Enkrid's grip. When Ragna asked why he was holding the sword so gently, Enkrid explained that it was to avoid dropping it. Curious, Ragna asked who had taught him that. Enkrid answered with Rem's name, causing Ragna to mutter it with irritation. He then instructed Enkrid to get into position. With a powerful leap, Ragna launched into an attack. Enkrid instinctively raised his sword and blocked, though his arms shook violently from the impact. Surprised, Enkrid asked what kind of force that was because it genuinely hurt. Ragna told him it was supposed to hurt and warned that stiffness would only lead to something breaking. Demonstrating again, Ragna described the hand positioning and compared Enkrid's posture to a rigid branch or a thick column, solid, yet inflexible. Enkrid silently wondered why every member of the squad spoke in riddles and strange metaphors. Trying to decode it, he questioned if the message was about being too tense, gripping the sword so tightly that flexibility was lost. Perhaps Ragna meant that without a relaxed grip and fluid motion, the blade would eventually snap. As the sword training continued, Enkrid held firm until Ragna entangled his leg, urging him to pay better attention to balance. Ragna demanded to know where his foot was pointed and, with a strike, accused him of stiffening again. He asked whether Enkrid wanted to snap his own wrist and compared his movements to a clumsy dancer fumbling under the sun. The heat bore down on them, and exhaustion became visible. Sweat clung to them both. Ragna studied Enkrid closely, his concern growing. He had not realized things were this bad. Enkrid lacked even the most basic fundamentals, and these were not lessons that could be taught through mere instruction. Despite his fatigue, Enkrid stood again, breath heaving, sword in hand. Looking at him with a mix of frustration and sympathy, Ragna said they would need to start from the most basic footwork. Their session was interrupted by another voice. Someone had been searching for them and remarked on their absence. Rem appeared and immediately commented on how they looked like they were having a picnic, wondering if they had skipped meals again. Tapping his axe on Ragna's shoulder, Rem asked Enkrid whether Ragna was giving him a hard time and offered to intervene. Ragna curtly told him to take his hand off. Puzzled by Rem's serious attire, Enkrid asked what was going on. Resting his axe against his shoulder, Rem replied that they were being summoned. Enemy forces had begun to assemble in the distance. Meanwhile, the fairy stood at an elevated position, overseeing the gathering troops. Enkrid and his squad took their places among the soldiers. Ragna stood nearby, filled with regret. Attempting to teach the sword had been a mistake. His own grasp of the technique was still unsteady, and Enkrid might not even survive the coming conflict. Resting his weapon across his shoulder, he silently considered whether to protect him. Enkrid's thoughts remained with the training, wishing he had more time to learn. He studied the formation around him and noted its oddity. The Grey Dog's flag flew high above the front line. One of the opposing commanders raised his hand after observing the layout and declared that this would be the end. With that signal, mist began to spill across the battlefield. The fairy immediately grew suspicious, believing the phenomenon to be magical. Soldiers reflexively raised cloth to their faces. Enkrid doubted the naturalness of the fog. He couldn't even see the soldier beside him. The battlefield quickly descended into confusion. Soldiers shouted, unable to see or hear what was approaching. Enkrid strained his eyes, detecting something within the mist. Some shouted about hearing or seeing something strange above them. Then, Enkrid yelled, spotting the arrows. The next moment, many soldiers fell where they stood. Knocking aside incoming arrows, the fairy realized this fog was no natural weather pattern. No one could have predicted such a tactic. She suddenly shouted for shields to be raised. From afar, the caster of the spell laughed with grim satisfaction. It had taken countless sacrifices, animal blood, pristine water from secluded lakes, and a series of continuous incantations. But now the spell was complete. The fog and mist swallowed all vision unless one stood at the center beneath the spell's casting point. With flags concealed and visibility lost, the battle would be entirely one-sided. He had given a name. This was the fog of annihilation. While Mitch demanded to know whether the figure standing in front of him looked satisfied, the response came with exhaustion. That person stated that the plan had only just managed to hold together. If the flag had burned down, as it nearly did, everything would have collapsed. Without that complication, this should have been an effortless victory. Mitch's attention shifted toward Encrid, and he hurled a scornful insult in his direction. The chaos was escalating. Someone in the squad shouted that the arrows were now coming from the front. Encrid turned his head just as an arrow struck the ground behind him. His eyes caught movement. One of his squad members called out, telling him to stay low. Encrid instinctively thought of Ragnar's position behind him. Another familiar voice, Ram's, rang out in frustration, stating clearly that this was a spell. Encrid mentally agreed. The voice was unmistakable, and yet, in the disorienting fog, he couldn't identify anyone with his eyes. Unable to see clearly or move with certainty, Encrid acknowledged he couldn't fight properly in this state. His breath had grown erratic. A strange object landed near his feet. Panic set in. His body stiffened, legs frozen, breath shallow. None of what Ragnar had taught him seemed usable in this moment. But then again, he had never expected to master everything after only one lesson. Ragnar's earlier words echoed back, that reverting to old habits would be inevitable if proper discipline wasn't established first, that fighting prematurely might only lead to death. Enkrid knew he had to survive the battlefield regardless of his incomplete training. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them again, the word death hovered in his mind. Noise surged all around him, metal, arrows, voices, footsteps, but his legs finally moved. Ragnar suddenly appeared in the mist, stepping forward and ordering Enkrid to move behind him. Enkrid refused. He declared that he had found a way forward. He knew he couldn't get it perfect on the first try, but he had to start now. Ragnar stared in disbelief and questioned his sanity. At that moment, an enemy emerged from the mist, spear in hand. The weapon found its mark, plunging into Enkrid's throat. Blood spilled from his mouth. His thoughts scattered. He realized he had taken the strike directly in the neck. And yet, a strange clarity accompanied the pain. With this, he would return to training with Ragnar. The enemy growled and commanded him to die, then shoved him backward into the fog. The morning repeated, and Enkrid was back at training. Kneeling, sword in hand, he endured Ragnar's critique. Ragnar questioned why Enkrid had fallen during the prior session and whether he truly understood the guidance being offered. Kneeling in front of him, Enkrid admitted silently that Ragnar wasn't a particularly great teacher. For a natural genius like him, everything came so effortlessly that putting things into words was a struggle. What came instinctively to Ragnar often lacked structure when explained. Ragnar stood thoughtfully, pondering aloud whether this was what people meant by understanding something but being unable to articulate it. All he was asking Enkrid to do was swing the sword downward. Was that really so difficult? From Ragnar's point of view, it was a simple request. Meanwhile, Enkrid wrestled with frustration. Ragnar wasn't mocking him. He truly didn't understand why this was hard for others. When Ragnar being asked about his center of gravity, he looked confused, responding with uncertainty. Ragnar paused and looked away, trying to formulate an answer. Enkrid noted that people like Ragnar often couldn't explain how they succeeded. They simply acted. Despite the poor instruction, Enkrid's strength lay in observation and repetition. He could remember stances and movements, no matter how many tries it took. On the battlefield, another alert rang out. Arrows were again incoming from the front. Enkrid raised his sword, deflecting them, but his hand trembled. The weakness was still there. Suddenly, a spear burst through the mist and impaled his throat once more. Pain surged, but his thoughts remained composed. Dying here only meant continuing the cycle of learning. He stumbled back, just narrowly evading another blow from Ragnar's blade. By now, Enkrid had kept track. This marked the 31st day. He could now move fluidly. Observing a particular step Enkrid executed, Ragnar complimented the maneuver and asked where he had picked that up. Ragnar acknowledged that the basics should now be within reach. Lifting his own sword, Ragnar recited the foundation of technique. The three essential offensive forms were cutting, stabbing, and slashing. A sword's edge was for both attack and defense. If the weapon was of good quality, even the sides could be used defensively. Pointing his blade toward Enkrid's neck, Ragnar explained that the short distance between two fighters defined the line of attack. Everything about swordsmanship hinged on extending one's own line while blocking the opponent's. He urged Enkrid to visualize the enemy in his head, and meet them with intention through the blade. Back on the battlefield, the same spear-wielding enemy appeared again. He lunged toward Enkrid, but this time, Enkrid lifted his chin and slipped just beneath the strike. The enemy stared in disbelief. Enkrid moved forward, realizing his feet felt light. Dodging felt natural now. As he advanced, 3 spears charged toward him. They pierced his chest one after another. Yet even in pain, he understood. Each day was bringing change. The morning repeated. It came with a loud clash, the sound of their blades meeting. Ragna asked whether Enkrid had just parried by tracking his sword. He noted the improvement, stating that even small progress, over time, made all the difference. Enkrid perished again during that skirmish, falling on the curved battlefield. But the next repeated day, he awoke to more training. Ragna commented that his diagonal slash was coming along well and needed no further correction. On battlefield, Ragna observed Enkrid sprinting and screamed, questioning whether he had lost his mind. Once again, Enkrid took spears to the body. And still, he smiled and believed this to be the only way forward, to create steady, undeniable progress. On a different day, Ragna executed a powerful leap, descending with force. Enkrid bent low, raised his sword, and blocked. Their blades collided with intensity, creating a burst of flame on impact. It was the 100th day. Ragna's eyes widened at the spectacle. He looked at Enkrid with suspicion and asked who he was. Enkrid met his gaze with a defiant expression, silently noting that Ragna no longer viewed him in the same way. Back at war, Enkrid reflected that he had once believed he couldn't improve beyond a certain limit. But now, even Ragna called out his name differently, asking him to wait. Enkrid surged forward, believing that his former limits had already been surpassed. He felt confident he could now withstand the enemy's spear and evade the lethal hail of arrows. As he advanced, thoughts of knighthood filled his mind. This was the path he had chosen. He confronted one of the spear-wielding enemies directly and was struck. Yet even beyond the pain, something lingered. A twisted laugh escaped his mouth as the agony overwhelmed him. It felt so intense, so exhilarating, that the sheer force of it could drive someone insane. The day repeated. Ragna called out to Enkrid, catching him by surprise. Ragna asked whether he truly wished to learn the sword. Reflecting on the moment, Enkrid decided that if boldness was what it took, he would die again and again if necessary. His reply confirmed his resolve. Scratching his face in wonder, Ragna expressed out that someone who had been fighting so ineffectively until now could suddenly display such progress unless it had been deliberate. Enkrid denied this. According to Ragna, the basics were clearly in place. What remained lacking was actual experience. On the battlefield, arrows poured down like rain upon the soldiers. Enkrid had repeated the same defensive move more than 200 times that day. As another arrow approached, he shifted his footing and crouched low, deflecting it effortlessly. Fixing his gaze ahead, he resolved to discover just how far his techniques could carry him. He dodged a spear by lowering his head and swiftly decapitated its wielder in a fluid motion. Though the fog still concealed much, he had learned to anticipate where the enemies would emerge. Even without sight, he could strike preemptively. His enemies reeled in shock. One of them shouted out, asking who was attacking. Another, assuming the murderer's stance, whispered there was no one there. In the next breath, Enkrid materialized and shattered his opponent's neck. The man beside him gawked, unable to process what he had seen. Confusion spread. Others nearby turned, asking what was happening and warning those around them to check the ground. A crossbowman trained his weapon downward, unsure of where the next threat might arise. Meanwhile, Ragna instructed Enkrid to always rely on the triad: eyes, feet, and hands. He was to look carefully, predict with his feet, and conclude with his hands. Enkrid laughed, the arrogance of growth bubbling out. It felt entirely different now. Everything had changed since the days when he fumbled with the fundamentals. Pushing forward, Enkrid carved his way through the opposing line. As he moved, he shouted a challenge, daring the enemy to face him directly. But then, a surprising sight stopped him. A wall of crossbowmen stood in a line before him, all weapons aimed in his direction. One of them acknowledged his impressive infiltration, but scoffed at the notion that he could escape alive. Enkrid exhaled sharply. While they steadied their aim, he boldly demanded they drop their crossbows and fight him with blades like proper warriors. His defiance seemed more like provocation, as though he welcomed the challenge. Offended, the crossbowman snarled an insult and gave the signal. Bolts were released in a coordinated burst. At that moment, Enkrid's mind retreated into an imagined space. A withered old man appeared there and scolded him, calling him a foolish mortal who had walked willingly into his own grave. He declared that Enkrid must have lost his mind. The next morning, Enkrid opened his eyes slowly and sat up. The memory of the vision still lingered. He wondered whether it had been merely a hallucination or something more, perhaps even a curse disguised in mocking form. A squad mate asked what he was staring at, or whether he was simply spacing out. Enkrid looked at Rem, the image of war still fresh in his mind. He recalled how the enemy's formation had lacked strategy, resembling the careless defense seen long ago on the grassy plains. Turning to Rem, he asked whether he knew anything about spells. Rem replied with another question, wanting to know why Enkrid was suddenly curious. Enkrid explained it was just a passing thought and asked for any knowledge Rem could share. Rem asked whether Enkrid understood the difference between magic and spell work. Enkrid rose and speculated that magic might be the more common of the two. Rem agreed partially, but clarified that spells required a medium, not merely as a requirement, but as the most essential element. Without a medium, a spell could not exist. The word medium sparked a connection in Enkrid's mind. He recalled the fog-covered battlefield and the enemy's standard. The realization came swiftly. The flag had been the medium. If that flag were to be destroyed, the fog would lift. Enkrid asked whether Rem's tribe used spellwork too, thinking about the Western origins of such arts. Since Rem came from the frontier, he might have insight. Rem smiled faintly and said he had encountered spells before. He added that most who claimed to be spellcasters were, in truth, hex users, a far more volatile craft. As Enkrid walked out, Rem called after him, wanting to know where he was going. Enkrid glanced back and replied that he was going to train. Before they began the training, Ragnar mentioned that he and Enkrid shared similar training routes. He asked whether Enkrid had heard of the Oniac sword technique. The narrative then shifted, reflecting on a legendary figure. Nearly 5 centuries earlier, there had been a child hailed as a 1-in-a-million prodigy. Born on a sword farm, the boy had once slain 12 bandits with nothing but a fireplace poker. Orphaned at a young age, he had picked up the sword before he could read. Word of his feats reached the ears of nobility and took him in. This child, Leonis Oniac, possessed unmatched talent. But his destiny was complicated. Despite his genius, a curse befell him, an evil eye that grew stronger with time. By the age of 10, his strength began to fade. At 12, he was fully paralyzed. Though he lived until 20, the sword prodigy was lost to history. Yet his mind endured. Leonis, though trapped in a motionless body, compiled every known sword technique into a unified framework. From his bed, he categorized all swordsmanship into 5 distinct forms, immortalizing his legacy for generations to come. Ragnar explained that was the righteous, elaborate sword, the heavy and strong sword, the swift, lightning-fast sword, and the gentle, parrying sword. These 5 styles form the basis of the Oniac technique. Solemnly, Enkrid echoed the words, the Leonis Oniac sword. Ragnar explained further. Leonis had rewritten the entire history of swordsmanship, and through this innovation, the Oniac family had risen to become the most revered house in the empire. Even today, the aftereffects of this technique endured, forming the core foundation of modern swordplay. Ragnar continued that each region had its own school. The northern heavy sword, the central righteous and flowing sword, the western swift sword, the southern confounding sword, and the eastern she sword. The specific technique Ragnar had developed stemmed from the northern heavy school. It was called the conscience of the beast. Enkrid repeated the name in a low voice, surprised by its weight. Ragnar said it would serve him better than the other, urging him to focus solely on a single point. He instructed Enkrid to shut out the world and see only 2 things, his sword and the enemies. Drawing his blade, Ragnar told him he would demonstrate how it worked. Enkrid watched in awe. The tip of Ragna's sword sliced the air and passed close enough to graze his neck. Stunned, Enkrid clutched his throat and realized that the strike had been faster than Rem's axe. Death had nearly found him. Ragna asked whether he had felt anything. Before Enkrid could respond, Rem approached in a fury, shouting accusations. He demanded to know whether Ragna intended to kill their squad leader. With complete nonchalance, Ragna claimed that people focused better when faced with death. He was merely helping. Still seething, Rem snapped that decapitation was not a proper teaching method. He demanded to know how long it had taken to master the heart of the beast. Ragna responded calmly. It could only be passed on through direct instruction. Rem warned him not to provoke a fight, but Ragna seemed unfazed. Rem stepped closer and said that when Ragna's grave was marked, it would read, "Lost his head to a southern barbarian." Ragna corrected him. He wasn't from the north. He came from the brutal southern tribes. Encrid, tired of their bickering, told Rem to stop. Then he turned to him and asked whether he was right to assume the visit was connected to a departure order. Before leaving, Ragna reminded Encrid of how clear things became in the final moment before death. If he could focus entirely on one point, if everything else vanished, then the sword would act as if guided by instinct. On the battlefield, Encrid recognized similarities with the heart of the beast. That technique dulled the senses and removed fear, making him numb in the face of death. But concentrating on a single point did something else. It heightened awareness. He needed more experience to master it. The spell trapping them used a flag as its medium. That flag had to be destroyed. Without it, the fog would break, and they could escape the slaughter. As the mist thickened around them and soldiers remained unaware of the trap, Enkrid added another goal to his mental list. Drawing his sword, he resolved to destroy the flag. Enkrid advanced through the battlefield, cutting down any enemy who dared approach. With both Ram and Ragna fighting nearby, he believed reaching the flag would be straightforward. Suddenly, a spear sliced through the air and skimmed past his face. He immediately retaliated, plunging his blade into the attacker's chest. Lifting his sword skyward, he glanced up with defiance. He would keep trying until there was nothing left to try. Another spear found his body, but even while dying, Enkrid noted how focusing on a single point sharpened his senses. He had died too many times from inattention. He had trained for years to survive battle. He had learned the heart of the beast, but now he concentrated on one point. On the current day, Ragna brought his sword near Enkrid's face and asked whether he finally understood. If successful, Ragna said, the tip of the blade should have seemed to slow, revealing the path of the strike. Enkrid, unsure, questioned whether the dull boldness of the heart of the beast was interfering with this newer skill. Ragna explained further. Only the opponent's sword should remain in focus. One should be able to read its path before it even moved. Enkrid considered whether challenging death so directly was truly the answer. He asked how Ragna had learned such clarity. Ragna simply replied that he always could. It was in the name. Concentrate on a single point. Realizing that Ragna would never explain things clearly, Enkrid concluded he would have to understand it on his own. There was no shortcut, and he had to be patient. From that moment forward, he would keep practicing this technique. But his primary goal remained: destroy the flag, minimize the casualties, and break through the enemy lines. Shouts rang out across the battlefield. Soldiers screamed that they couldn't see. Enkrid yelled back, urging them to drop to the ground and raise their shields. Ragna glanced over, taken aback by Enkrid's composure. The arrows came thick, fast, and deadly. They struck the shields, but failed to pierce. Enkrid, also under cover, reminded himself he had practiced that same move 300 times already. He cast aside his shield and charged forward. With his eyes closed, he predicted the attack paths. An enemy looked ahead in disbelief, searching for a target. But Enkrid appeared behind him and drove his sword into the man's throat. Enkrid tore through the enemy ranks with a single swing, cutting down multiple opponents in one motion. Amid the chaos, one soldier barked insults, calling Enkrid's advance absurd, while another, shaken, observed that it was just one man. They began to pursue him in a rush. Yet Enkrid, calm and lethal, dispatched the enemies trailing behind before cleaving through the one standing directly in front of him in a seamless continuation of movement. Near the flag, A stationed soldier cried out to his comrades, urging them to stop Encrid. But Encrid smiled with defiance and struck. The soldier's sword shattered to fragments, and in the next instant, Encrid severed his life by breaking the stem of the flag he had sworn to protect. Staring at the fallen banner, Encrid thought about the 10 days it had taken to reach this point. He had finally arrived at the flag, but before he could feel victorious, something unsettled him. The fog remained. His eyes widened in disbelief. In that moment of confusion, enemy blades found their way to him. Multiple strikes landed across his body at once, and blood spilled from his mouth. One of the warriors laughed, mocking his understanding of spells. He told Enkrid that he had been fooled. He might know something about spell work, but not enough. Enkrid processed the words. If this flag wasn't the source, then perhaps there was only one true flag among them, and the rest had been decoys. There were 6 in total. The following day, amidst battle, Ragnar asked Enkrid why he insisted on taking everything upon himself. Enkrid didn't answer. He had calculated the odds. There was a 1 in 5 chance of striking the right one on the next attempt. Charging forward, he yelled to the others to get down and raise their shields. The soldiers, unable to see through the mist, questioned what he was saying. Their confusion cost them. Many were struck down by arrows. Watching helplessly, Enkrid shielded himself. He wondered why they hadn't listened as they had before. Perhaps the timing had been off. They needed a moment to breathe. He pursued the second flag for 3 days. It too was a fake. That meant 4 remained. He then spent 5 days on the third. Another decoy. When he finally reached the 4th flag, after 72 days, it proved to be yet another false lead. Facing the final 2, he studied their positions. He silently evaluated them, letting his instinct lead him. The furthest flag, distant and deliberately placed, appeared to be the most important. It had to be the real one. On the current day, Enkrid sat on the battlefield with his comrades, instructing them to cover themselves. Arrows were incoming again. Holding his shield, he called out to Rem, telling him to follow. As Enkrid rushed forward, Rem watched him dart into danger, questioning whether he had lost his mind. Enkrid knew the flag was far off, but he had to conserve energy. He couldn't afford to be exhausted before reaching it. Enemies spotted them and shouted insults. Enkrid moved ahead while Rem, with swift precision, hurled his axe at one of them, killing him instantly. Enkrid hoped Rem would serve as a distraction and draw their attention so that he could slip past. Rem retrieved his weapon and growled, demanding to know who cast the spell. But seeing another foe in his path, he threw the man aside, muttering that perhaps the next one would have answers. As they moved together, Rem kept dispatching the enemies who blocked their advance. It had been over a year. Enkrid had lived and died through countless repetitions of this same scenario, trying to reach the real flag. Now, he stood before what he hoped was the final one. He prepared to strike, determined to end the fog once and for all. But then a sword intercepted his attack. The weapon forced his blade back. Mitch stood there, eyes fixed on Enkrid, claiming divine providence had brought them together again. He had always wanted to kill Enkrid himself. Enkrid stared at the man, confused. He asked who he was. Mitch flinched slightly, taken aback by the question. He responded, half laughing, saying that even in just a few days, Enkrid had already forgotten him. Enkrid said nothing. Mitch advanced, swinging his sword and declaring that once Enkrid was stabbed, his memory would return. Enkrid saw the blade's tip and swiftly sidestepped it. Mitch's expression shifted. Enkrid moved in and aimed for Mitch's chest. Mitch retreated, avoiding the blow. Looking at Enkrid, Mitch was surprised. This wasn't the same man he had encountered before. His growth was undeniable. Mitch scoffed internally, wondering if Enkrid was trying to close the distance in a single leap. As Enkrid pressed in again, Mitch blocked, sword raised. Enkrid's body trembled with strain. He recognized that Mitch was sincere in his mastery. His technique was grounded in the righteous sword style, but he blended it seamlessly with the flowing sword technique, capable of reflecting incoming attacks. Enkrid countered with all his strength, only for Mitch to parry the blow cleanly. Enkrid focused intensely. A single distraction could throw off his balance. Mitch's sword cut the air, narrowly missing Enkrid's arm. Enkrid forced himself to pour everything into that one moment. The battle, the flag, even the techniques, none of it mattered now. Only the sword remained in his world. Mitch's eyes flared. He drove his sword forward, stabbing Enkrid directly in the heart. Blood poured from his mouth as he coughed violently. Staggering, Enkrid raised his head and glared at his opponent. He remembered. His voice trembled with pain as he identified Mitch as the one who had once blocked the flagpole on the grassy field. Mitch studied him with suspicion before formally introducing himself, declaring his full name and rank as the platoon commander of the Greyhound Squad from the Aspen Principality. Enkrid shared his own name and rank, identifying himself as the newly appointed squad commander from the Nolilia Kingdom. One of Mitch's juniors leaned in and asked whether Enkrid was an enemy. Mitch replied curtly, stating that he was, particularly one with a talent for hiding. As Enkrid stood calmly, Mitch observed his expression and noted a wistful look on his face. Then, narrowing his eyes, Mitch asked why he was smiling. Enkrid returned a sharp glare, saying nothing, though inwardly he recognized something profound. What he had needed wasn't simply the clarity that came from the edge of death or the fear that preceded it. What he truly needed was a worthy rival, an opponent who would stake everything in a battle and push him to match that resolve. Mitch, unsettled by the silence, questioned whether Enkrid was simply insane. With little ceremony, he drew his sword from Enkrid's body. The next day, Ragna brought up the sensation once again. He remarked that focusing on a single point felt strangely similar to the nervousness experienced in the moment before death. Enkrid averted his gaze, lost in thought. Noticing the shift, Ragna wondered if Enkrid was tuning him out, as if he were quietly surrendering. Rem soon arrived with news. They had been summoned and were to gather immediately. Enkrid gestured toward Ragna, signaling it was time to go. As Ragna glanced at him, he noted an unusual energy emanating from the younger man. Strange as it was, Enkrid looked more invigorated than ever. Ragna hefted his sword onto his shoulder and wondered if he ought to intensify the warm-ups that day. A similar scenario had played out the day before. Arrows had rained down on the squad, but Enkrid's timely orders had saved them. Not a single strike had landed. Once again, Enkrid bolted ahead, calling to Rem to join him. Observing the charge, Ragna declared he would go as well. Unamused, Rem shouted whether Ragna was planning to catch an arrow with his forehead. Ragna grumbled in return, warning Rem to keep his eyes forward unless he wanted one stuck right between them. As the three advanced, a wave of enemies appeared, but they were quickly dealt with. Enkrid focused on carving a path through in the same manner. As he pushed forward, he encountered Mitch once again. With bold arrogance, Enkrid greeted him and demanded a fight. Mitch questioned whether Enkrid had truly come seeking him. Enkrid smirked and asked whether this was Mitch's first confession. He then claimed he had fallen in love at first sight. Mitch, raising an eyebrow, remarked that his squad, the Greyhounds, were famously persistent lovers, and that this was the first time anyone had ever come searching for him. Enkrid asked whether that upset him. With a scoff, Mitch raised his sword and dismissed the entire exchange as nonsense. Enkrid charged in and was stabbed through the chest, but even in pain, he welcomed the return of pure concentration. All that remained in his awareness was the blade. Mitch observed him sitting wounded and commented that he hadn't expected him to lose so easily. He admitted he couldn't understand what had driven Enkrid to charge forward with such confidence. Enkrid, looking downward, reflected that his own approach had been flawed. It lacked the proper spirit. It hadn't been deliberate enough. In the battle the next day, Enkrid launched another attack on Mitch. This time, he told himself he needed to be absorbed into the rhythm of combat. Even as he was struck again, he believed that through repetition, he would recapture that elusive state. By the 18th time, he began to glimpse it. By the 28th, he could invoke it intentionally. By the 48th day, Ragna returned to teach him again. Bringing his sword close to Enkrid's face, he demonstrated the principle. Enkrid locked onto the tip of the blade, and just as Ragna moved, he instinctively deflected it. Ragna stepped back, startled, and asked whether Enkrid had managed to counter by focusing on a single point. Enkrid confirmed it silently. Pure concentration, that meant total synchronization between body and blade. As he turned away, he realized his power and technique had developed beyond anything he could have imagined before. And still, he knew he would have to repeat today once more.